I used to share a house with two of my buddies, Kevin and Marcus. It was a small place with 3 bedrooms, nothing fancy. The 3 of us had been tight since our school days. Kevin and I even lived together for part of our college years. At the time of this story, we were 27, just getting by with our different jobs. I had a typical 9 to 5, Marcus was hustling with odd gigs, and Kevin was a grad student who also worked as a delivery driver. The neighborhood we lived in wasn't the friendliest either, probably because most people there were renting, just like us. A lot of houses were split up into smaller apartments, and many had multiple mailboxes stacked out front, which seemed pretty normal for that street. Our house was one of the few that hadn't been chopped up yet, but then there was this house down the block that stood out. We joked that it was a drug house at first, something we laughed about, but as time went on, it stopped being funny. I didn't know much about the people who lived there, but you could tell something was off. They seemed like the type to be mixed up in shady stuff, especially drugs. I've been around that scene before, so I can usually tell. I'd been clean for over 4 years by then, but I knew the signs. There were plenty of weird things going on around that place. One time, I woke up in the middle of the night and couldn't fall back asleep, so I headed downstairs to grab a glass of water. As I passed by the window, I noticed 3 cars lined up in the street, just sitting there with their engines running. It was odd because they hadn't bothered to park, and this was at 3 a.m. I walked over to the front window to get a better look, and I saw 2 sketchy-looking guys hanging around in front of that house. After a few minutes, I went back to bed, but kept an eye on the street. The cars didn't move for another 10 minutes before they finally sped off. I wasn't sure what they were up to, but it didn't sit right with me. The next day, I mentioned it to Kevin and Marcus. Turns out they'd seen strange things happening too. We all knew something was off, but we chose to ignore it. We figured it was better to stay out of whatever was going on there. A few weeks later, something else happened. I was dead asleep when a scream woke me up. One of those high-pitched, blood-curdling screams. It sounded like it was right outside. Groggy, I rolled over and peeked out my window, which faced the street. The lights from the lampposts outside didn't show anything unusual. The street looked empty, just like always. Still, I knew I hadn't imagined that scream. It had to have come from nearby, even though nothing seemed out of place. I stared out into the darkness, half expecting to see someone, but there was no one in sight. The screaming stopped just as quickly as it had started, leaving me wide awake but with nothing else to hear. I tried to push it out of my mind and go back to sleep. The next day, we talked about whether or not we should call the cops, but we had no solid reason to. After all, the scream was gone, and there wasn't anything else to report. The thought of moving crossed my mind, but I couldn't afford anything better at the time. I didn't feel like we were in any real danger, so we stayed. Life continued, and things quieted down for a bit. Then one Friday night, the 3 of us were just chilling, playing video games in the living room. We had another friend over, so there were 4 of us that night. Our living room was right at the front of the house, and the window faced the street, though we usually kept the curtains closed. If you peeked through them, you could catch a glimpse of our porch. It was around 10 p.m. when we heard footsteps outside. We figured it was our other friend, Jake, who said he might come over but hadn't shown up yet. I got up to take a look. When I peeked out the window, I saw a guy standing on our porch. He was wearing what looked like a bedsheet draped over his shoulders. And that's not all. He only had 1 shoe on. He didn't knock or anything, just stood there facing the door, like he was waiting for someone to let him in. We watched him for a while, trying to figure out what he wanted. He barely moved, just stood there, completely still. After about an hour, we started feeling uneasy, and finally decided to call the cops. Our friend needed to get his bike from the porch, and none of us wanted to go near the guy. When the cops showed up, the guy in the sheet just casually walked away, heading down the street towards that sketchy house. The officers talked to some people at that house but didn't do much, just gave them a warning or something. A week later, I was walking home late and saw 2 police cars parked outside that same house. I never walked too close to it, so I didn't get a good look at what was going on. But as I walked inside, I thought maybe they were finally getting busted for whatever was going on there. That must have been it because, after that, we never saw them again. Within a couple of weeks, it was obvious they were gone. A month later, some new people moved into the house, and things seemed quieter. I never found out exactly what they got in trouble for, but my guess was drug dealing. The whole situation just gave off that vibe. All the strange things we saw leading up to that felt like they were connected somehow. But what still gets under my skin, even now, is that scream I heard that night. It could have been someone in real danger, or maybe just some unhinged person freaking out, but we'll probably never know. We ended up staying in that house for another few years, and things definitely felt better without those neighbors around. This happened around 2010 when I was 10 years old. I lived in a small suburban neighborhood where each street had houses on both sides. Behind our homes, there was a narrow alleyway that ran between the backyards of each row of houses. My house was at the edge of this path, and our backyard faced one of the alleyways. On the other side of the back alley lived an old woman, whose name I never knew. I don't know what her story was, but for some reason, she absolutely hated me. She was strange, always keeping her windows spray painted over so no one could see inside. But somehow, that didn't stop her from staring out her window straight into mine. At night, she kept her blinds open and would shine this weird red light into my bedroom, making it hard to sleep. Sometimes she'd even scream at us, shouting how much she despised us. One winter morning in February, I missed the bus to school. My dad told me to wait outside by the car while he grabbed his keys, saying he'd be right out. As I was walking towards the car, I noticed her coming out from the alley near our backyard, walking slowly. In her hand, behind her back, was a huge kitchen knife. Before I could process what was happening, she raised it and started sprinting after me. My heart was pounding, but I was faster than her. I managed to get inside and slam the door shut. She didn't follow me in, though. Instead, she stood on the neighbor's porch, glaring at our house. My dad rushed outside when he heard the commotion and yelled at her. She just sneered and shouted something about wanting to get rid of all the annoying kids in the area. We called the police, but when they arrived, they just told her to go back home. Later, an ambulance showed up to take her away, but nothing much else came of it. My parents had to attend some kind of court thing after, but I never knew what really happened there. I didn't see her again for almost a year. It was late November, and snow had fallen overnight. I was excited to go outside and play, so I rushed to the front door. As soon as I opened it, I froze. There she was, standing on our porch, facing the road. My stomach dropped. Without thinking, I slammed the door and locked it, running upstairs to my parents' room. When we looked out the window, we saw her casually walking down the street, disappearing into the distance. We moved not long after that. I've heard from some people who still live there that she's still around, and her windows are still covered in spray paint. It doesn't haunt me like it used to, but I still can't stand the sight of knives. When I was about 24, I shared a small apartment with my mom, my younger sister, and my two boys, who were still in their toddler phase. We had a neighbor, a guy in his early 60s, who worked for some local utility company. And to be honest, he always gave off unsettling vibes. Not dangerous, but enough to make me feel uneasy whenever I crossed paths with him. One day, we were getting our internet upgraded, and another employee from the same company came to do the work. I thought our neighbor was weird, but this new guy took things to another level. Every time I walked through the room where he was working, he'd just stare at me. Not like a normal glance, but long enough to make me feel uncomfortable. His eyes would follow me, and I couldn't shake this feeling of being watched in a way that sent chills down my spine. That weekend, on a Sunday, the neighbor decided to throw some sort of loud gathering at his place. To my dismay, I spotted the creepy installer among the group of people hanging out on his porch, already looking tipsy. They were loud, rowdy, and as the day turned into evening, it was clear that things were only going to get worse. By the time 8:30 p.m. rolled around, the noise was almost unbearable, and both my mom and sister had left for the night, leaving me alone in the apartment with just my two boys. Just as I was trying to get the kids ready for bed, there was a knock on the door. When I opened it, there he was, the installer guy from before, standing right in front of me. The guy was definitely wasted, slurring his words as he claimed he needed my mom to sign some form he forgot to get the day before. I tried to keep it cool, said, "No problem, I can sign it for her." But he made a move like he was about to step inside. I quickly shifted to block the door, making it clear he wasn't getting in. Again, I said, "I'll just sign whatever you need," hoping he'd get the hint. Instead, he pointed towards our kitchen and mumbled that he'd already given the form to my mom, saying it was inside the apartment. Then he pushed harder against the door, trying to force his way in. This time, I shoved back more firmly, making sure he knew he wasn't coming any closer. As soon as I did that, he glanced to his left and muttered something, which made me lean just enough to see who he was talking to. That's when I spotted my creepy neighbor, standing pressed up against the wall outside, hiding in the shadows just out of my sight. My heart started racing as I realized how sketchy this was getting. I stepped back fast, slammed the door, and locked it as quickly as I could. Through the peephole, I watched them both walk away, disappearing down the hall like nothing had happened. It wasn't until later, when I was talking it over with my family, that the real weight of how dangerous that situation was hit me. Why would this guy need a signature for a paper he supposedly already gave my mom? Why come so late at night, especially after I had seen him drinking all day? And why did they wait until my mom and sister had just left, timing it almost perfectly? But the biggest question of all, the one that still haunts me, was why my neighbor was standing there, trying to stay hidden. My gut had been screaming at me that something was off, and I'm so thankful I listened. I don't even want to think about what might have gone down if I'd let him through the door. I used to be with this guy named Nick. We met through a few mutual friends, and at first, everything seemed pretty normal between us. But there was something about him that never sat right with me, something I couldn't quite place. Nick had this weird habit of popping up at places where I'd be, and it always seemed like a coincidence. It happened more than just a couple of times. It felt like I was being followed by my own boyfriend, which gave me chills. There was this off-putting vibe about him that made me wonder if I should have stayed away. To be honest, though, I wasn't in the best place mentally. I was pretty down, struggling with some bad habits, and feeling like crap about myself. Nick knew all this, so when he kept pushing to be with me, I just went with it. We ended up dating for about 3 years. Around the halfway point of our relationship, he landed in jail, and I had to move back in with my folks. Every other weekend, I'd make the 3-hour drive to visit him. That's when I started noticing a change in him. He became more possessive, and there was something off, like he wasn't comfortable in his own skin anymore. The times I couldn't make it to see him seemed to push him closer to snapping. I'm pretty sure something bad happened to him in there. When he finally got out, I ended up moving back in with him. That's when things spiraled even worse. He started getting into heavy drugs. One night, we had a few friends over, and Nick was way over his limit. He checked out, lost in his own head. Even after everyone left, it was like he didn't even notice. I went upstairs to crash, leaving him downstairs in his weird trance. I fell asleep pretty quickly. Then suddenly, I was being jolted awake. My whole body was shaking, and when I opened my eyes, I saw Nick over me, shaking me violently. His eyes were red, wide, and wild. He was breathing like a wild animal. "Where is it?" he demanded. I had no idea what he was talking about. When I asked him what he meant, he got even angrier. "Where is it?" he snarled again, louder this time. At this point, my fear started turning into frustration. I was pissed off, half asleep, and annoyed. I snapped back at him, telling him I didn't know what the hell he was talking about, and rolled over, trying to go back to sleep. He stormed off downstairs, and the next thing I know, I hear stuff smashing, glass breaking, things being thrown around. I jumped up to see what was going on. Before I could even make it downstairs, Nick charged back up the stairs and shoved me hard, knocking me to the floor. He pinned me down with all his weight. Now, I'm barely 5'4" and 120 pounds, and he's easily 6'3" and close to 220. I had my phone in my hand, and he snatched it from me. That's when the terror hit me again. It was like he wasn't even Nick anymore. like something else had taken over his body. He was staring at me like a predator sizing up its next meal. His eyes locked onto mine, and after what felt like an eternity of silence, he finally spoke. "Don't tell anyone. They can track it. Everyone knows you're here. They can't find out." My heart was racing, and I started to struggle under his weight, desperate to break free. His grip tightened, and then he said something that froze me in place. "I killed someone." For a moment, everything stopped. Then, without warning, he let go of me, broke down sobbing, and ran off. My body kicked into overdrive. I threw on whatever clothes I could find and dashed out the door, sprinting towards my car. The second I got in and turned the key, I saw him charging toward me. I panicked, screaming as I tried to throw the car into reverse, but before I could, he popped the hood and yanked something out of the engine. It hit me. I'd left my phone inside the house. My only connection to help was gone. He slammed the hood shut and disappeared back into the house, taking whatever he ripped out of the engine with him. I sat there in the car, paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do next. Through the window, I could see him pacing, frantically searching for something. He was consumed by whatever madness had gripped him. I started crying, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The engine was still running, but I had no idea what he'd done to the car. I didn't want to risk driving and breaking down in the middle of nowhere. The neighbors were close, though. If I could make it to their house, I'd be safe. I waited for the right moment, watching as Nick moved out of sight. Then I threw the car door open and bolted. The sound of footsteps pounding behind me made my blood run cold. I turned my head, and there he was, chasing me. His wild eyes locked on me like a hunter after its prey. I screamed, running as fast as I could toward the neighbor's house. I pounded on the door, begging for them to let me in. When they finally opened it, I rushed inside and slammed the door behind me, locking it immediately. I stood there, waiting, bracing for him to come crashing through, but he never did. I peeked through the small glass window in the door. He was gone, vanished into the night. The neighbors let me use their phone, and I called my parents to come get me. I left everything behind. My phone, my stuff, even the car, which technically was in his name. I didn't care. I just needed to get away from him. I never spoke to Nick again. But even now, years later, I still get chills thinking about those bloodshot eyes, the way he chased me like he was possessed. That was the wake-up call I needed to pull myself out of the mess I was in. I contacted the police and told them what he said, but I never heard anything back. Maybe it was just the drugs talking, but I'm certain that if I hadn't left that night, things could have ended much worse. It all kicked off around January. I'm still debating whether I should get the cops involved, but honestly, it's freaking me out. On weekends, I usually crash at my girlfriend's apartment. She's in college, living in an off-campus building with 2 other roommates. Right next door are a few of her close friends. One night, I jolted awake to the sound of screaming, 2 a.m. sharp. Now, living near a college, hearing rowdy noises from people stumbling home from bars isn't unusual. But this scream was different. It was gut-wrenching, the kind that makes your blood run cold. A girl was screaming for her dad. She shouted, "Dad!" at least 4 times. I couldn't wrap my head around how my girlfriend was still asleep. Meanwhile, my heart was racing like crazy. At first, when I told her, she brushed it off, thinking I must have had a nightmare. But there's no way I imagined that scream. It was way too real. That night was disturbing, but things didn't stop there. About 3 months later, one of her neighbors texted the group chat, asking if anyone else had heard screaming. Then, a week to the day, another neighbor chimed in. Same story, same time of night. By the following week, one of her friends, who lives a couple of blocks away, had roommates messaging about hearing the same thing at 2 a.m. It was becoming too much of a pattern to ignore. I started wondering if this was some kind of bait for something sinister, maybe even trafficking. Less than 2 months later, close to midnight, my girlfriend's roommate swore she heard a girl shouting, "Get off!" She rushed to the window, but by the time she looked outside, there was nothing, just empty streets. That was the last time anyone heard anything. These incidents felt too calculated, too well-timed. What makes everything worse is that my girlfriend and her roommates live in this house without a proper deadlock on the door. It's unsettling, to say the least. When I was 12, we had just moved into a house in a quiet little town. It was the first time my family owned a home instead of renting. The neighborhood seemed safe, and we quickly got to know a bunch of people. Our closest friends lived just 4 doors away, a family with a son my age and a daughter the same age as my little sister. We started having dinners together and taking turns hosting weekend barbecues. Everyone got along, and the friendship felt solid, like we'd known each other forever. But after a year, things started feeling off. Cops would show up at their house now and then, usually in the evening. I asked my parents about it, but they always brushed it off, saying the police were just checking in. That didn't sit right with me. If it was normal, why didn't they check on us too? I wasn't the sharpest kid, but even I knew something wasn't adding up. One afternoon I was hanging out at their place. The son had run across the street to meet up with another friend, leaving me alone with his dad. It wasn't unusual. This had happened a few times before. But this time, something about him felt different. There was an odd vibe in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I should leave. But before I could make up an excuse, he said he had something cool to show me. I can't remember what exactly he mentioned. Maybe something about old sports cards. I liked that kind of stuff, so I followed him without thinking much about it. He pulled down the old wooden attic ladder and told me to come up. At first, I didn't think much of it. I followed him without a second thought. But then something strange happened. I was behind him on the ladder, and when he turned to help me up, I noticed something in his expression. His face, his eyes. There was something wrong. The smile he gave me wasn't friendly. It was something darker, like a mask slipping for just a moment. That look burned itself into my brain. I couldn't quite explain why, but alarm bells were ringing in my head. Without thinking, I jumped back down off the ladder and bolted for the door. I ran all the way home, legs shaking and tears building up in my eyes. When I burst through the front door, my mom was there, immediately asking what was wrong. I was a mess, barely able to speak. After I calmed down enough to explain, she seemed concerned, but ultimately told me I was just being overly dramatic. Maybe I was imagining things, she said. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something awful had just been avoided. That night, sometime after 2 a.m., I woke up to find my mom sitting on the edge of my bed. She was holding me tight, rocking me like I was a little kid again. I could feel her tears landing on my face. I remember thinking how strange it was for her to be so upset, but then I saw the flashing lights outside my window. The street was filled with police cars, and an ambulance parked in front of our neighbor's house. Later, we found out what happened. The neighbor's dad had taken his own life, and his daughter's, up in that very attic after a long standoff with the police. To this day, I know deep in my gut that if I had gone up that ladder, I wouldn't be here. That thought haunts me every time I think about it. When I was around 11 years old, I lived in a small town with my mom and 2 younger brothers. Our house was a simple 2-story with a small backyard. It was close to the middle school I attended, so most of the families nearby had kids my age. This was in the early 90s, and back then, all the neighborhood kids would hang out outside every day. We'd ride bikes, play basketball, or just run around until the sun started to set. As soon as it got dark, we'd hear our parents calling for us to come inside. One of my neighbors, Tim, was a year older than me. He lived right next door, and though we weren't super close, we occasionally hung out because, well, we lived so close to each other. That summer, Tim and I started spending more time together, maybe just because there weren't many other kids around that year. Pretty soon, his friend Kevin was hanging out with us too. Kevin lived in a different neighborhood, but he'd come over either by bike or when his mom would drive him. I recognized him from school, though we hadn't really talked much before. The 3 of us would spend hours wandering around the town, looking for things to do. Our town had a few nice parks, and sometimes we'd head over to the woods nearby to explore the trails. One day, Tim suggested we go a little deeper into the woods that bordered our town. I didn't bring anything with me because we weren't planning to stay out too long. Just a short walk from my house. Kevin, though, had his backpack, but I didn't think much of it at the time. We wandered through the woods for a bit before I remembered this hidden spot I knew. It was an old tree house some older kids had built years ago, now abandoned. I thought it would be a cool place to hang out. When we got there, Kevin suddenly wandered off a few steps away, and I assumed he was going to use the bathroom or something. But when he came back, he had this weird grin on his face. That's when I noticed he was holding a gun. Tim chuckled awkwardly, but I felt my heart drop into my stomach. I had never seen a real gun before, and it looked too real to be a toy. Kevin started waving it around like it was no big deal. I glanced at Tim, and we exchanged nervous looks. We were both scared out of our minds, but neither of us knew how to react. Everything had gone from normal to completely terrifying in just a few moments. It all happened so fast, I barely had time to process it. To be honest, I never really liked Kevin. He always made me uneasy, like he was ready to pick a fight at any moment. His unpredictability kept me on edge. Kevin kept fooling around with the gun, waving it like it was some kind of toy. Neither Tim nor I had the courage to step in or say anything. And then, out of nowhere, the gun fired. It wasn't aimed at any of us, thankfully, but the blast was deafening. My ears were ringing so loud I couldn't hear anything for what felt like forever. Birds scattered from the trees above us, and Kevin dropped to the ground, clutching his hand. For a moment I thought he'd shot himself. My heart was pounding. When I looked closer, I realized he wasn't hit, but his hand was messed up, probably from the recoil. He had fired the shot with so little control that he ended up hurting himself. We started heading back, but the tension was thick. My ears were still ringing, and Kevin looked like he was holding back tears. I didn't say a word, afraid that one wrong comment might set him off. Tim kept quiet too, both of us just walking in silence. As we got closer to the edge of our neighborhood, Kevin suddenly turned to me, his face serious. "You're not going to tell anyone about this, right?" I was startled. It hadn't even crossed my mind to tell anyone. "No, I won't say anything," I mumbled, still shaken. Tim nodded along in agreement. We all went our separate ways after that. But things were never the same between me and Tim. Not long after, I found out that Kevin's dad had figured out he'd stolen the gun. I'm still not sure how his dad knew, but I can guess. Maybe he noticed the gun was fired or missing, or maybe one of the neighbors heard the shot. Either way, Kevin's dad caught him. Kevin, though, was convinced that I was the one who ratted him out. He started spreading rumors about me at school, telling everyone that I was a snitch. He even told people he was going to fight me. Tim took Kevin's side in everything, which wasn't a shock since they were closer friends. Every time Kevin came over to hang out with Tim, I felt this sinking feeling in my gut. I knew I couldn't stand up to him if things got physical. He was unpredictable, and honestly, I was terrified of him. One night, I was lying in bed when I heard voices coming from the backyard. I got up and peeked out the window, and there they were, Tim and Kevin, standing in the shadows. As soon as I opened my curtains, they must have noticed because they bolted. That moment stayed with me, always making me paranoid. Not long after, on my walk home from school, they ambushed me. Tim pushed me hard against a fence, gripping my shoulders tightly. Kevin stood there watching, a smirk on his face, before stepping forward and landing a couple of punches while Tim held me in place. I didn't even try to fight back. I was too scared that resisting would only make it worse. For weeks, I lived in constant fear. I'd hear whispers at school, people telling me Tim and Kevin were plotting something. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for the right moment to strike again. But as the weeks turned into months, the bullying just stopped. I think one of the teachers caught wind of what was going on and did something about it, but I never found out for sure. I didn't care why it ended. I was just relieved it was over. The whole thing, especially that day in the woods, haunted me for years. Fast forward to a few years later. I was away at college by then, and my mom had moved out of our old neighborhood. She didn't go far, but we no longer lived near Tim's family. I had no idea what Kevin and Tim were up to, but during winter break, I ran into Tim at a party. I didn't expect to see him there, but there he was, leaning against a wall, a beer in his hand, looking almost the same as he had back in middle school. I froze for a second, unsure if I should just walk away or say something. Tim noticed me and gave a small nod, so I walked over and said, "Hey." We made small talk for a bit, carefully avoiding the events of that summer, as if they never happened. Surprisingly, the conversation flowed easily. For a moment, I almost saw the Tim I had once hung out with, before everything went wrong. But we both knew what hung in the air, too heavy to mention. After a while, we went our separate ways, and I never saw him again. Looking back, I think Tim felt guilty for what happened. He had to know I wasn't the one who told on Kevin, but he still went along with the whole thing anyway. I didn't bring it up though. It was in the past, and by then, I was over it. Still, I sometimes wonder what happened to Kevin. I doubt he turned out too well. Just for context, I'm a 25-year-old woman now, but I was 23 when this all went down. I had just moved into my first place at 21, thanks to some help from my parents. It was a small one-bedroom apartment in a 3-story building that sat on a busy street, not far from the subway station. My place was on the 2nd floor, and the windows overlooked the street. The building only had 8 units, 2 on each floor, and 1 in the basement. The laundry room was also down in the basement, so every once in a while, I'd pass by the door to the basement apartment. The guy who owned the building, Simon, lived in that basement apartment. I figured he stayed there to save some cash, considering how pricey the building must have been to maintain. He was pretty quiet, probably in his late 30s, and kept mostly to himself. The few times we did cross paths, he seemed friendly enough. He worked a full-time job on top of managing the building, so he was always on the go. I lived there for a few years, but I never really got to know him. One time, in a rare conversation, Simon mentioned he left for work every morning around 6 a.m. and didn't get back until about 6 p.m. After that, he'd usually be doing some sort of maintenance, whether it was mowing the lawn out back or fixing something in one of the apartments. Across the hall from me was another tenant, Jason. He was probably in his mid-40s, though I never asked. I had no clue what he did for a living, but he was home a lot. Our apartments were separated by a short hallway, just for the two of us. No one else had any reason to be there. The hallway had a small window at the end with frosted glass. You know, the kind that you can't really see through. Jason had put a little table and a folding chair by the window, turning it into his own makeshift patio. It was strange since it wasn't outside, and the view wasn't great. Sometimes, when I'd leave my apartment, I'd see him sitting there with a beer. It creeped me out a bit, and I'd avoid going out whenever I could. Still, despite my weird feelings about Jason, nothing really happened in the building for the most part. I worked as a secretary at a local clinic, and it took about 20 minutes by subway to get there. My job kept me busy, and when I wasn't working, I'd often hang out with friends after hours, so I wasn't home that much. One night, after a long shift, I went out with some coworkers. We hit up a couple of bars, and time just slipped away from us. It was pushing 2:30 a.m. by the time the bar finally kicked us out. After that, we wandered around for a bit, grabbed some late-night food from a cart, and ended up in a small park just chatting away. By the time we said our goodbyes, it was creeping up on 3:30 in the morning. I grabbed a cab home, barely keeping my eyes open, eager to fall into bed after such a long day. The taxi dropped me off in front of my building, and I watched it drive off before heading toward the door. That's when I realized my keys were gone. Panic washed over me as I stood there, running through the night in my head. I quickly figured out that I must have left them at the last bar. I had a vague memory of putting them on the table because they were digging into my leg. Yeah, they were definitely there. But of course it was too late to go back and grab them. The place was already closed. My landlord, Simon, could have let me in, but I didn't want to wake him. He worked crazy hours and didn't get home until late as it was, and now it was almost 4 a.m. I figured it'd be rude to bother him. I decided I could wait until morning, He usually left early for work anyway, so I could catch him then. The street was dead, only the occasional car passing by in the distance. I probably should have felt nervous being out there alone, but honestly, I was a little buzzed and not thinking clearly. I leaned against the side of the building, staring at the darkened windows. Out of nowhere, the front door opened, and I jumped a little. It was Jason, my neighbor from across the hall. He stepped outside, squinting when he saw me standing there. "Locked out?" he asked, his voice a little rough, like he'd just woken up. "Yeah," I muttered, still flustered. "I think I left my keys at the bar. Just gonna wait until morning to ask Simon to let me in." Jason took a step closer, giving me a strange smile that made my stomach tighten. "You can hang out in my place if you want," he offered, nodding toward the stairs that led up to our floor. Something in me immediately screamed not to. "No, I'm good," I said quickly. "I'm good," I insisted, trying to sound casual. "I'll just wait out here until Simon comes out. He's always up early." Jason frowned, clearly annoyed now. His face hardened, and I could feel the tension in the air. Before I could react, his hand shot out, grabbing my arm. My heart raced as he yanked me inside the building. I screamed and tried to fight him off, kicking wildly, but he was strong. He dragged me down the short hallway toward our apartments. In my struggle, I kicked over that small table and chair he had set up by the window, trying desperately to grab onto something, anything. But there was nothing to stop him. Just as we reached his door, Simon appeared at the top of the stairs. I hadn't heard him coming, but suddenly he was there, staring at us. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Jason immediately let go of me and stepped back. I bolted toward Simon, shaking. We called the cops right away, and I was beyond relieved to have someone there who saw everything. Otherwise, it would have just been my word against Jason's. Simon helped me back into my apartment, but I couldn't calm down, knowing that Jason was just next door. When the police arrived, Jason spun some ridiculous story about how he was just trying to help me since I was too drunk to get inside. Sure, I'd had a few drinks, but I wasn't out of control, and I was clearly fighting him the whole time. Simon had witnessed the entire thing, so there was no way Jason's excuse would fly. Apparently, Simon had been getting ready for work and heard the noise in the hallway. I was lucky he was awake and came out when he did. There was no way I could have overpowered Jason by myself. I don't even want to think about what might have happened if Simon hadn't shown up when he did. In the end, Jason was charged with assault, but he only spent a day in jail. The silver lining was that Simon used the incident to evict him from the building immediately. Without what happened, it would have taken months to get him out of there legally. Even though the whole thing was terrifying, I stayed in the building for another 1.5 years. Thankfully, I never saw Jason again. Yeah, this isn't a joke. It's been a while since I even thought about writing this, but something happened not long ago that I just have to share. This didn't start with me directly, but my mom was the first one pulled into it. Somehow, though, I ended up being the target. It all began a few weeks back. My mom had just gone out for some smokes, probably around 11 p.m. or so, and was walking home with one of her friends. That's when they bumped into Darren. We'd seen him around before, just some guy who lived in the area, but we barely spoke to him. He was mostly just a face we recognized in passing. This night, though, Darren wasn't acting right. Whether he was drunk, high, or both, I can't say for sure, but he was completely out of it. Darren came up to them, shouting like he was furious about something, and then, get this, he just whipped his junk out. Right there. My mom and her friend tried to brush it off and keep walking, but Darren wasn't done. He started swinging at my mom. Both of them fought back, managing to stop him. But instead of leaving, he followed them at a distance, heading toward our apartment. I had no clue this was even going on while I was at home, chilling, completely unaware. So, they finally made it to the building and headed upstairs. That's when my mom realized she'd forgotten her key. She's always been forgetful like that, but I'm usually home, so it's no big deal. The issue? Darren didn't just stop at his floor. He followed them all the way up to ours. Just as I heard my mom calling my name, I rushed to the door, totally confused. She was trying to get inside, but Darren was right behind her, pushing against the door. He managed to force his way in before we could lock it. That's when I had no choice but to get involved. I grabbed a kitchen knife, telling him to get the hell out. And luckily, he did. But for some reason, Darren didn't take this as a sign to leave us alone. Nope. He seemed to think I was challenging him to a fight. So, after we slammed and locked the door behind him, he went off, screaming outside about how we were cowards. He kept yelling for us to call the cops, bragging that he knew the landlord and could get the security footage erased. Meanwhile, my mom was quick on her feet, recording him through the door as he pounded on it, trying to break in. Eventually, he took off when he heard my mom actually talking to the cops. You'd think that would be the end of it, right? Nope. Things only got worse. Just a few minutes later, he was back, but this time, he had a knife. He started stabbing at our door, yelling all kinds of threats at us, even saying he'd take out the cops too. The operator on the line could hear every word he was shouting, and I guess that finally got the police to care enough to show up. Now, our building's doors are pretty solid, made of metal or something similar. So while Darren managed to leave a few scratches and small dents, he couldn't break through. Frustrated, he yelled that he'd be downstairs waiting for the police. My mom quickly passed that on to the cops we were still talking to on the phone. And just as he made his way down, the cops arrived, coming up through both elevators. There were 2 in our building. 4 officers knocked on our door, and when we let them in, we explained everything. My mom showed them the video she'd recorded, while I took some pictures of the damage Darren had done to the door. The cops, clearly not thrilled to be here, told us to come down with them. So, my mom and I followed. As we headed downstairs, we could already hear Darren shouting again, and we were on the 4th floor at the time. He was screaming loud enough for us to hear it all. But the second he saw the cops, he changed his tune real quick. "Ah, crap," he muttered, acting all calm now that they were around. The officers weren't buying any of it and slapped the cuffs on him right there. His friends, who must have been nearby, showed up not long after, yelling at the cops and asking what Darren had done. They didn't stick around for long, though, and bolted when things started getting more serious. Darren was hauled off, and I took all the pictures and videos to send over to a lawyer. Then, nothing. Just silence. I'm not sure whatever happened with the damage claim. It felt like everything just vanished into thin air. You'd think that'd be the end of it, but no. Darren didn't get much of a punishment. He ended up with just a restraining order, which meant he couldn't talk to us or cause any more trouble. But since he still lived in the same building, there was nothing stopping him from being around. This peace didn't last long. Maybe 2 weeks after, I was heading out to grab some stuff from the store. Right outside the building, there's Darren, hanging out with his buddies. They were drinking, laughing, just doing their thing. The second I step out, Darren's whole mood changes. He cuts off whatever they were talking about and says, "See that guy? I'm gonna mess him up. He got the cops on me." I panicked. I was already out of the building, and to get back inside, I'd have to walk right past them. So instead, I decided to keep walking toward the store, thinking I'd be safer out in public. I tried calling my mom to let her know what was going on, but she didn't pick up. Of course, just my luck. Now, here's where I'll admit I wasn't exactly thinking straight. Instead of calling the cops right away, I figured I'd check if they were still hanging around when I got back. By the time I returned, Darren and his crew were gone, so I hurried upstairs and told my mom everything. She calmed me down and pushed me to call the cops. The same officers from the last time showed up, and honestly, I was relieved. They already knew what kind of person Darren was from the previous incident. But the problem this time? We didn't have any proof, just my word against his. The cops had us wait in the hallway while they called their supervisor to see if they could arrest Darren again, given his history and the restraining order. Meanwhile, Darren and his friends were hanging out in the stairwell, being obnoxiously loud and laughing. I later found out his sister was with them too. After what felt like forever, the police got the green light from their boss. We headed toward the stairs, and I tried to stay out of sight as much as possible while they went to arrest Darren again. Of course, he acted like he had no idea what was going on, playing dumb. His friends scattered as soon as the cops arrived, but his sister wasn't as quiet. She was furious, yelling at the police and saying they were arresting him for no reason. Darren got taken away again, and just like before, there was nothing. No calls from lawyers, no follow-ups from the police, complete silence. Within the week, I saw him again, though. He didn't make eye contact and avoided me and my mom whenever we crossed paths. He'd walk the other way if he spotted us first. I wish something more had come out of this whole mess. But honestly, I'm just relieved he's been leaving us alone. Even though I can tell he's still bitter every time he sees me. I live in a quiet neighborhood not far from a large, wealthy city. Most of the people around here work in high-paying jobs. Doctors, engineers, that kind of thing. I was 16 when everything started going wrong, and my younger brother was just finishing up middle school. We live at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by families with kids about our age. Directly across from us was this guy named Jake. He lived there with his wife and their little girl. Jake was an engineer at some local company, and when they first moved in, he seemed like a great guy. We even invited them to our barbecues and block parties. For the first year or so, everything seemed totally normal. Then, things started to get weird at Jake's house. His lawn was always overgrown, their pool turned green, and his wife and daughter started disappearing for days at a time. We'd still see Jake, but he was always alone, usually speeding off in his flashy car. At first, nobody knew what was going on, but it wasn't long before rumors started flying. Apparently, Jake had snapped. One night, after drinking too much, he pulled a gun on his wife during an argument. That's when his family started staying away for longer stretches. It was in the middle of one freezing night in January that I woke up to sirens blaring. It was around 3 a.m. and I was half asleep, but the noise was too loud to ignore. When I looked out the window, my stomach dropped. There were cops, fire trucks, and even an ambulance parked in front of Jake's house. It turns out he'd gotten wasted and decided to bury himself in a snowbank, completely naked. He wouldn't let the police or paramedics help him either. Watching the scene unfold was surreal. We all felt bad for the guy. He used to be so nice. But somewhere along the way, he just lost it. By the time summer rolled around, things had only gotten worse. Jake's drinking had spiraled out of control. He lost his job, lost his driver's license, and things weren't looking good for his family either. One afternoon, I was home alone with my brother and the kid next door. Our parents both worked during the day, and my brother was close friends with the neighbor's kid, so I was stuck watching them. Right around lunchtime, a police car pulled up in front of our house. The officer came to the door and told me Jake had stolen a car, sped through the neighborhood, and might have a gun. This wasn't the first time he'd been arrested for something like this. He'd been caught with illegal firearms before. The cops said that Jake knew the neighbors had called the police on him, so he'd ditched the car and taken off on foot. The last place anyone had seen him was in the woods behind our house, and they had no idea where he was now. You know that feeling you get when you lose something important, like your wallet or keys? That sinking feeling? That's exactly how I felt, but 100 times worse. The officer told me to call them right away if I saw Jake near his house again. It sounded like they'd completely lost track of him. After the cop left, I went into full panic mode. I locked every door and window in the house. I told my brother and the neighbor's kid to call their parents and let them know what was going on since they were still at work. An hour went by and the two of them were just hanging out in the living room watching cartoons. I stayed in the dining room, keeping an eye on the backyard through the window. After a while, I noticed the trees on the edge of our yard were moving, like someone was trying to force their way through. My heart jumped. I told the kids to stay away from the windows and to be completely quiet. Not long after, I saw Jake's head pop out from behind the trees. He spotted me through the window, then quickly disappeared back into the woods. I grabbed my phone, freaking out, and called the cops again, telling them he was still hiding in the trees behind our house. Jake knew what my parents' car looked like, and since it wasn't in the driveway, he probably figured out I was home alone. I felt a little better knowing he had gone back into the woods, but it was terrifying to think he was still so close. About an hour passed with no sign of him. Then, suddenly, Jake appeared again, this time walking out of the woods and into our backyard. I lost it. The only thing separating me from him was the sliding glass door. I dropped to the floor and hid behind the kitchen counter. After what felt like forever, I slowly peeked over the counter. Jake was just standing there, about 20 feet from the door, staring straight at it. He didn't move a muscle for a full 10 minutes, just watching the house. Eventually, he bolted toward the front yard, and that's when I noticed he had something in his pocket. I couldn't tell what it was, but he kept his hand on it as he walked back down the street and into his garage. The cops showed up soon after, but since he was back inside his house, and there wasn't much proof besides neighbors saying they'd seen him speeding around, they couldn't do much. They gave him a warning, but it didn't seem like it mattered. It was his word against everyone else's. As time went on, Jake's behavior got worse. He became even more unhinged. He'd lock himself in his garage for hours, and it wasn't long before people started noticing he had a bunch of propane tanks in there. He was planning to set them off. One day, our next-door neighbors smelled gas leaking from his garage, and they immediately called the cops and the fire department. The hazmat team had to go in and pull him out before anything could blow up. In my junior year of high school, Jake just disappeared. One day, he was gone without a trace. The rumors started flying. Some said he'd been sent to a mental institution. Others thought he was in prison, and some said his mom had come to take him out of state. No one really knows what happened to him. His house still sits empty, and it's creepy as hell. I still live in the same neighborhood, but I sleep a lot easier knowing Jake isn't there anymore. My wife and I have been following your channel since last year, and we figured we might have a story you'd like. It's been around 4 years since we moved out of our first home, but back when we first settled in, we had this really sweet old man as our next-door neighbor. He was retired, and most of his days were spent in his backyard, taking care of the flower beds his late wife had left behind. Our bedroom window gave us a clear view of it, and almost every day we could see him out there, lovingly tending to the plants like they were his only connection to the world. One afternoon, my husband called me upstairs, sounding a little confused. When I got to the room, he was standing by the window, staring into the neighbor's yard. I asked him what was up, but he didn't say anything, just motioned toward the window. So I walked over to see what had him so focused. There, in the middle of the yard, was our neighbor, slamming a shovel into the ground repeatedly. He seemed determined to dig a hole, and it wasn't just a small one. It looked like he was really going at it. It struck us as odd, but after a quick talk, we decided it wasn't anything serious. Maybe he was putting in a new tree or some other project that needed a deep hole. The next day, my husband's voice had an edge of panic when he called me upstairs again. Expecting something strange, I rushed to the bedroom, and what I saw this time sent shivers down my spine. The hole was much bigger now, and it wasn't shaped like anything you'd need for landscaping or gardening. This was something else entirely. It was unmistakably a grave. I know it sounds crazy to say we could tell, but there was no mistaking it. The real giveaway was the wooden cross that was laying beside the hole, right at the end, like it was waiting for something. Without hesitation, my husband hurried over to check on him, and I sat there, anxiously waiting, counting every minute until he returned. As soon as he walked back inside, I asked what the neighbor had said. He just sat down on the couch, shaking his head and mumbling that he didn't really know. I was so irritated. How could he go over there and not ask about the giant grave-sized hole in the backyard? But he explained that he didn't want to make it obvious that we'd been watching him. He said when he got to the door, something about the whole situation felt off. He couldn't bring himself to bring it up. He mentioned how strange the neighbor seemed, like the friendly old man we used to know wasn't there anymore. Usually, the neighbor was all smiles and small talk, but this time, it felt like there was something darker underneath. My husband said we should just keep an eye on him, and if things got really weird, like if we saw him actually burying something, we'd call the police. This was early on a Saturday morning, and for the rest of the weekend, he practically set up camp in our bedroom, glued to the window, watching the neighbor's backyard like a hawk. On Sunday afternoon, he called me upstairs again, and this time, the neighbor was clearly working on a second hole. Now, you have to understand how awkward this whole thing was for us. It's not against the law to dig in your own yard, and technically, he hadn't done anything wrong. But if he really was up to something horrible, we couldn't just sit by and say we didn't do anything. I finally convinced my husband to call the police. I told him either he made the call or I would. So, he picked up the phone, and I stood right there, watching him as he explained everything to the dispatcher. He told them our neighbor had been digging what looked like graves in his backyard, and while we hadn't seen him put anything in them yet, the whole thing was just incredibly unsettling. The cop on the other end didn't seem too alarmed at first, but we figured it was best to at least let them know. After all, something about the whole thing was just too strange to ignore. My husband was like, "Yeah, all right, thanks," before hanging up the phone. He told me that the cops were sending a patrol car over to ask our neighbor a few questions. We didn't want to make it obvious that we'd called them, but we were dying to know what the neighbor had to say. So when the squad car rolled up in front of his house, we snuck down to our garage to eavesdrop. One of the walls of the garage was super close to his front door, and if you opened one of the windows, you could catch most of the conversation. We opened the window just enough to hear the cops tell him they'd received a complaint about some weird activity and asked if they could come inside to take a look around. I didn't know what to expect, but I was definitely not ready for the sharp, almost angry, "You got a warrant?" from our normally friendly neighbor. We thought the cops might actually have one, but turns out we were clueless. Getting a warrant isn't as quick and easy as a single phone call from some nosy neighbors. The police left soon after, and we bolted back upstairs, hoping to catch a glimpse of what our neighbor would do next. Was he going to get rid of the wooden cross, fill in the graves, or just keep on digging like nothing happened? My husband beat me to the window, but as soon as he looked out, he turned back, his face pale. "He's looking at us," he whispered. I knew I shouldn't, but curiosity got the better of me. I had to look. And sure enough, there he was, standing right by the graves, staring directly at our window, his face twisted in anger. I tried to act like it didn't bother me, giving him a quick wave and a fake smile before yanking the curtain shut. But I left a tiny gap on the side so we could still keep an eye on him and those holes in the ground. By that point, watching the graves had become almost like an obsession for us. The next morning, when we got up for work, there was a new surprise waiting for us. Not only had he planted another wooden cross at the second grave, but he was already hard at work, digging a third one. By the time my husband and I got back home from work that day, our neighbor had already started digging a fourth grave. We couldn't stop thinking about where this was headed. And the worst part? We'd convinced ourselves that the third and fourth graves were meant for us. Somehow we were certain he knew we'd been the ones to call the cops on him. That night, we made another call to the police, telling them how worried we were about what our neighbor was doing. When they transferred us to the right officer, he told us they were working on getting a search warrant and that they'd check the house as soon as they got it signed. But waiting felt impossible. We'd heard enough stories about bad things happening while people sat around waiting for a piece of paper. My husband suggested that maybe the cops could reach out to any of the guy's family members, assuming they had that information, and get them to check on him before things took a darker turn. Luckily, it seems like that's exactly what happened. About a week later, after nothing had changed, my husband spotted someone younger walking up to the house with a set of keys. He went out to ask her if she knew the guy, and she told him that, yeah, it was her dad's place. She said he hadn't been feeling well lately, so he'd gone to stay with her for a while. She was just there to grab some of his clothes and a few other things. We didn't think she knew everything about what we had seen, but my husband said she looked exhausted, like whatever was going on with her dad had really taken a toll on her. About a month later, a for sale sign went up on the lawn, and a moving crew showed up, packing up the guy's stuff and loading it into a van. A few days after that, a landscaping team came by to fill in and cover up the graves. They looked just as uneasy about the whole thing as we felt. After that, we didn't hear anything else about it. My husband didn't want to push the daughter for answers. It already seemed like she was barely holding it together. Some people might say it was sad to see an older guy losing his mind like that, but I'm not sure that's what was happening. He seemed sharp when he talked to the cops, and the way he figured out it was us who'd called, that didn't feel like the actions of a confused mind. Looking back, it was one of the most unsettling things I've ever been through. To this day, I still wonder what his true intentions were for those graves. A few years back, we bought this cozy house with a little stream flowing through the backyard. The setting was perfect, peaceful, something we thought would be a dream. On the third day after moving in, our neighbor from the house next door came over to introduce herself. "Hey there, I'm Amy Voss," she said with a bright smile. There was something strange about our conversation, though neither my husband nor I could put our finger on it. As soon as she left, we exchanged puzzled looks, both thinking, what was that all about? That afternoon, I joked to my husband, "I can't believe we live next to someone who decorates with plastic flowers." But when we woke up the next morning, every single one of those flowers had disappeared. It was like something straight out of a creepy TV show. Whenever I'd be outside, whether tending to the backyard or working in the front, Amy would pop up out of nowhere, starting a conversation. She had this weird way of saying things that would throw you off, forcing you to respond. Before I knew it, she'd squeezed a bunch of personal details out of me without me even realizing what she was doing. It wasn't just her awkward chats either. Amy had several dogs, and their barking was a nightmare. No matter when we went to bed, the second we turned the lights off, those dogs would start barking under our bedroom window. After months of this, we realized she was waiting for our lights to go out before letting them loose. Creepy, right? I eventually asked her, politely, to keep her dogs away from our window at night. She just smiled this big, unsettling grin and said, "Nope, can't do that." After that, the barking only got worse, like she was doing it on purpose. Her harassment escalated. Whenever she started acting weird, I'd either be polite or quietly put my gardening tools down and head inside. Even though I never saw her actually watching me, she always found ways to let me know she had seen everything I did. It felt like I was being stalked. Oddly, she never bothered my husband, and when I tried to tell him what she was up to, he didn't believe me. That is, until one day when I took his car somewhere. Amy must have thought I was home alone, so she ramped up the creepiness. When I got back, my husband was visibly shaken. He finally believed me after that. We had another neighbor on the opposite side, and one day, I decided to ask her if she had any issues with Amy. She spilled years' worth of stories about the nightmare she'd been through with her. My heart sank. What had we gotten ourselves into? Eventually, we filed a complaint with animal control about the dogs. They asked us to document when the barking started and stopped, and it turned out the dogs were barking around 60 to 70 hours each week. I couldn't keep track anymore. It was just too much. Amy wasn't thrilled when she found out about the complaint. She escalated things by calling 911 on us. Happy Valentine's Day, right? Every few months, Amy would call 911, claiming I was harassing her. By then, I wasn't even speaking to her anymore. I'd just head inside the second I saw her coming out. What we didn't know at the time was that she'd get into a wheelchair right before the cops showed up. She'd give them this sob story about how I, her mean neighbor, was tormenting her. She was only a couple of years older than me, but she played the fragile, elderly woman card hard. I guess because I look younger, thanks to my stylist, the cops always took her side, thinking she was some helpless senior while I was the bully. After a few rounds of this nonsense, we installed hidden cameras around our property. It took 2 months before she called 911 again, and this time, when the officer came over, he got an earful from her. He told us to leave her and all the other neighbors alone. But when we offered to show him the footage, his whole attitude changed. The video didn't just show Amy without her wheelchair. It also revealed that all the things she claimed I had done to her were actually things she had done to me. A bit before we set up the cameras, she had even tried to run me down with her car while I was out on a walk. When one of her friends attempted something similar, we caught it on tape. Strangely, Amy called the cops first, twisting the story in her favor. The officer who responded didn't even bother watching the footage. Typical. Amy's creepy behavior didn't stop there. Sometimes she'd park her car in front of our house and just sit there, staring at us. She'd snap pictures and record videos of us, even while we were inside. After we got the cameras, though, she only did that once more. The cameras aren't super obvious, but if you zoom in close enough, you can spot them. I guess once she realized we were watching her, she toned it down a bit. Things stayed calm for nearly a year. We started to relax, thinking maybe it was over. But one night, There was this huge bang, and the whole house shook. We peeked out the bedroom window to see a few cars in front of Amy's place, with people loitering in her yard. We checked the camera footage and saw her son throwing something at our house, right toward our bedroom. Then, boom, the explosion shook the place. Thankfully, it didn't cause any real damage, just some burned plants in the yard. When we called the police, they didn't even file a report because there weren't any injuries or serious destruction. A few days later, we met with a realtor. We'd had enough. Psycho neighbor or not, we were ready to move on and never look back. A couple of years back, I found myself living out of my car. I had just graduated from college and was drowning in student loans. At 23, I figured this would be a smart way to cut down on rent. I was in Northern California, where rent is through the roof, but the mild climate made living in my car doable throughout the year. One evening, I decided to park in a neighborhood that felt familiar. It was close to a small lake and only a few streets over from where my old roommate used to live. I figured I'd be safe since I had walked around that area many times, even at night. I parked, double-checked the locks, hung up my makeshift curtains, and put in some cheap earplugs to drown out the noise of passing cars. Then, I settled in for sleep. The thing about those earplugs, they were awful, but got the job done. They usually slipped out sometime during the night, which I didn't mind because it meant I could still hear my phone's alarm in the morning. It must have been around 3 a.m. when I stirred, the earplugs already out, and I felt something was off. I became aware of a soft scratching sound near my window. It started on the front passenger side, then slowly moved toward the back doors. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest as I remembered I always left my windows cracked just a little for fresh air at night. For a second, I couldn't process what was happening. Should I move? Stay still? My mind raced, but my body stayed locked in place. That's when I saw it. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness. A man outside was shining his light around, clearly trying to find a gap in the curtains I had hung up. To my horror, he found one. The light hit right where my face was. It's hard to explain, but the way I was laying meant I could see the light, but he couldn't make out my eyes. The scratching noise started again, moving across the car's windows. That's when I realized this wasn't just someone trying to break into a car. They knew I was inside. I felt completely helpless, unable to even reach for the small metal bar I kept beside me for safety. I wish I could tell you I screamed something heroic, something fierce, but all I managed was a shaky, "Can I help you?" It sounded lame as hell, but it echoed in the stillness of the night. For a second, there was silence. Then I heard him bolt, his footsteps pounding against the pavement. But the weirdest part? He was laughing, like actually laughing, as if this was all some twisted joke. I was still too frozen to move for what felt like forever. Eventually, his laughter fading in the distance gave me just enough courage to reach for my bat and scramble into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking, but I got the engine started and sped off without looking back. I crashed at a friend's place for the night. Now, I rent an apartment. The next morning, I retraced my steps. It wasn't until then I realized I had parked just a block away from a dive bar. Turns out, it had closed right around the time everything went down. My family had planned a trip this past summer to visit my Aunt Sarah and her son Luke. Luke was 15 at the time, just a couple of years younger than me. Aunt Sarah's house was this old farmhouse, way out in the middle of nowhere. It was surrounded by open fields and dirt roads, with long porches wrapping around the front and back of the house. You'd think being out in the country would be peaceful, but it didn't take long for Luke and me to get bored. By the time the sun started to dip below the horizon, the air had cooled down to that perfect evening chill. It felt like the kind of weather where you just have to go out for a walk, so Luke and I snuck out through the back field. The field ended at a dirt path, and we followed it for a bit until we came across a small, rundown building. It was some kind of old food plant, maybe a factory or something. You could smell something like canned beans or peanuts hanging in the air. We wandered around to the back of the place where a few delivery trucks were parked. They were those big, white trucks with the double doors in the back. I'm not sure why we thought it was a good idea. but Luke grabbed the handle of one of the doors, and it opened right up. It wasn't locked. We climbed into the back, and as soon as I pulled the second door behind us, I left a tiny crack for some light to come through. I had my phone on me though, so we used the flashlight to look around. There was nothing inside. The back of the truck was completely empty. Still, in our dumb teenage minds, we thought it'd be cool to carve our initials into the wall of the truck. Just as we were about to leave, Luke froze. I looked over and saw his eyes wide, staring through the little gap in the door. He motioned for me to be quiet, and that's when I saw it too. A figure walking slowly across the parking lot, coming straight toward us. At first, I thought it was maybe a guard or someone who worked at the plant, but Luke was already freaking out. He started breathing heavy, almost like he was going to pass out. And then it happened. The guy stopped, turned, and started heading directly for the truck. I grabbed Luke, slapped my hand over his mouth, and we crouched down low. My heart was pounding in my chest as I pressed my head flat against the door, peeking out through the tiny gap. The man stood right outside, just a couple of feet from us. Neither of us dared to breathe. How that guy didn't open the door is still beyond me. He was right there, staring straight through the small crack. My heart was beating so fast it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I saw him cough, revealing those rotting, crooked teeth. Somehow, though, he didn't touch the doors. He just stood there for a moment, then turned and walked back toward the factory entrance. That's when we bolted. Luke hit the pavement with a loud thud, and just as I was about to jump out too, we both froze. The man was standing not far from us. He wore a black hoodie, all torn up, and his jeans were in rough shape too. What stuck with me the most was the jagged scar running from his mouth up to his right eye, and the twisted smile full of broken teeth. It was the kind of image you don't forget, no matter how much you try. I leaped down from the truck, but before I could even shout, "Run!" Luke was already gone, sprinting like his life depended on it, which, to be honest, it probably did. I had no idea he could move that fast. The guy in the hoodie pulled out a knife, and without thinking, I took off running too. Behind me, I could hear him yelling and cursing, the sound getting closer with every step. We cut through the fields, the tall grass whipping against our legs. In the distance, I could finally see the lights of Aunt Sarah's house, just a little further. I glanced back one last time, and there he was, a dark figure, standing motionless in the grass. Even though it was getting darker by the second, I swear I could still make out that crazy smile beneath his hood. It was burned into my mind. We made it back to the house, collapsing onto the porch, both of us gasping for air. Fred's face was pale, eyes wide. We told our family what happened, though we left out the part about sneaking into the truck. Aunt Sarah called the cops, and about half an hour later, an officer showed up. They ended up finding the guy. Turns out, he used to work at the plant but had been fired because of his unstable mental state. Since that night, I never leave the house after dark without something to protect myself. I can't help but wonder what would have happened if that guy had opened those doors and found us hiding inside. This happened back in the early 70s, when my family moved into a small duplex in a quiet part of town. I had 2 little girls, one of them just over a year old. Our upstairs neighbors had a daughter the same age as mine, and they quickly became the best of friends. They also had twin boys who were older. The husband had served in the Korean War, and although people didn't talk about it much back then, he was suffering from what they now call PTSD. He had a decent job and adored his boys, but always longed for a daughter. When she was born, she had serious health problems, things nobody could have predicted. Doctors later figured out it was linked to some chemical exposure he had during the war. Something in his genes got damaged, but only affected girls. His sons were perfectly healthy. The guilt of it all crushed him, and he blamed himself. Eventually, he turned to alcohol to cope, which made everything worse. One evening, there was a knock at my door. It was his wife. She asked if she could stay with us until her husband passed out. He was drunk and in one of his bad moods. About an hour later, we heard heavy pounding on our door. It was him, demanding to know where his wife was. We tried to explain she'd come back once he calmed down, that she was afraid of him in this state. At first, it seemed like he understood and left, but not even an hour later, we heard the door slam open. He had a shotgun. He was furious, shouting for his wife to come back upstairs. I stood between them, the barrel of his gun just inches from my face. I don't even remember exactly what I said, but I made it clear I wasn't afraid to die. I've always been religious, and I felt at peace with whatever happened. Meanwhile, my husband was in the bedroom, secretly calling the police. The man eventually lowered the gun, but he left us with a chilling threat. He was going to shoot his children. The cops arrived within minutes, and a tense standoff stretched on for hours. My family and his wife escaped through the back window and hid at a neighbor's house. He kept the kids inside, saying he'd kill them all. I'm not sure what finally convinced him to surrender, but they eventually took him to the hospital for treatment. It was terrifying when it happened, and I still get chills thinking about it. I live with my parents on a farm just outside a small town. We're about a half-hour drive from the nearest city, and our house sits on a long gravel road that branches off the main highway running through the area. We'd only been living there for about 3 years when all this happened, and I was starting 11th grade at the time. I had gone through 9th grade at my new school, which wasn't easy, but I had made a close friend, Caleb, who lived nearby. I would hang out at his place now and then, and sometimes he'd come out to our property. Our place was on a huge lot, and our nearest neighbors were a good distance away. A few miles down the road lived an older man who rarely left his house but was friendly enough when we saw him. In the opposite direction, closer to the highway, lived an elderly woman and her grown son Mike, who was probably in his mid-50s. I wasn't sure if he had a job or if he was just taking care of his mom. One hot day in July, Caleb came over. School was starting in about 3 weeks, so I guess it was late July. We were hanging out in the backyard because the weather was nice, but after a few hours, we got bored and decided to walk around the dirt roads nearby. The area was peaceful, with a mix of farmland and dense woods, and we sometimes saw deer or other animals like coyotes, groundhogs, or the occasional skunk. There were still a few hours of daylight left as we set out, with the sun low but still bright behind us, casting long shadows ahead. That's when I heard a car approaching from behind. I glanced back and immediately recognized the car. It was Mike's. There were only a few people who drove around here, so it wasn't hard to tell. It was an old, beat-up red car with dark-tinted windows and a faded white stripe down the middle. Even from a distance, I could tell something was off. The car was swerving all over the road like the driver had no control. Caleb and I stopped in our tracks, staring for a moment before I bolted off the road into the ditch. Caleb followed quickly behind. We didn't know what was going on with Mike, but we didn't want to take any chances. As the car got closer, it veered off the road and into the ditch where we were hiding. The car sped straight toward us, nearly tipping over as it plowed through the narrow ditch. For a split second, I thought we were going to get run over. Panicked, Caleb and I scrambled into the cornfield just in time, barely dodging the car as it roared past. We watched from the safety of the tall corn as the car swerved back onto the road, our hearts pounding in our chests. Thinking it was finally over, we cautiously stepped out of the field and back onto the road. We were still rattled, standing there watching the car as it swerved away. But then, out of nowhere, it stopped. We couldn't believe it when it started backing up, heading straight toward us again. Without thinking, we bolted off the road and hid in the field. The car rolled up to where we had been, and the door creaked open. Mike got out. We stayed low, crouching behind the tall corn, peeking through the stalks. He stood there for about 30 seconds, not saying or doing anything, just looking around. Then, as suddenly as he had stopped, he got back in and drove off. We were completely freaked out. First, we thought we were going to get run over. Then when he came back, I was sure he was going to come after us. But as we watched him, it was clear to me that Mike was definitely wasted. Once the coast seemed clear, I poked my head out of the field, checking the road. When we were sure it was safe, Caleb and I hurried back toward my house. We cut through the fields, not wanting to risk being seen on the road again. When we made it home, my dad was out front, working on some project in the yard. I ran up and told him everything that had just gone down, He stayed calm though, which honestly surprised me. He just told us to head to the backyard for now. What happened next is what my dad told me later, because I wasn't there. He decided to go over and talk to Mike and his mom. That's how people around here deal with stuff. No one really calls the cops unless they absolutely have to. So, my dad walks over to their house, and he sees Mike's car parked all crooked in the driveway, one of the back tires half sunk in the garden. Dad knocked on the door and Mike answered. Right away, my dad knew he was drunk. He said there was no point trying to reason with him, but that didn't stop him from laying into him. He said he tore into Mike, shouting for a good few minutes while Mike just stood there, trying to act like none of it happened. Mike kept saying he was just driving by, that he saw us dive into the field, and was only backing up to check if we were okay. He completely denied running us off the road, and even claimed his car had never left the pavement. When Dad got home, he called the cops. They came out and went over to talk to Mike, but when they questioned him, he flat out denied that he'd even been driving that day. So, with no real proof and nothing to go on, the cops couldn't do anything about it. After that, things got weird around the neighborhood. My parents didn't let me go out alone for months, and they made it clear that I wasn't allowed anywhere near Mike's place. We still saw him around though. He'd drive by sometimes and I'd get that same uneasy feeling every time. One night, I was out with some friends, and when they were dropping me off, we drove past Mike's house. His car was parked out front, with the lights on. As we passed, I glanced over, and there he was, sitting in the car, staring right at me. Our eyes met for a split second, and it sent a chill down my spine. When I got home, I ran inside and locked the door behind me. That was the last real encounter I had with him, but I still live here, and part of me is always on edge, wondering if something else is going to happen. Hey everyone, now that my creepy neighbor finally left about 2 weeks ago, I feel comfortable sharing this story. Let me start by giving a bit of context. I moved into my apartment in a hurry because I needed to get away from a terrible roommate situation. I didn't have time to check out the area like I normally would, but I figured it was fine since I knew the neighborhood fairly well. I live in a small 4-unit building and have a 1-bedroom apartment on the bottom floor. I assumed everything would be okay since I'd seen most of the other tenants when I checked out the place. Turns out, I hadn't met everyone. The guy who lived directly above me was this greasy old man, probably in his mid-60s, with a beer belly that hung over his pants. The moment I saw him, I got this really bad vibe. At the time, I was working odd hours, usually coming home anywhere between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., depending on which of my 2 jobs I was at that day. I'm a pretty quiet person. Sure, I listen to music now and then, but never too loud and always during the daytime. One night, around 11 p.m., I got home from work. I was heating up some leftovers and watching a video on my phone when I heard this loud banging at my door. It was the guy from upstairs. Let's call him Greg. He was pounding on my door and ringing the bell over and over like a maniac. The noise he was making was way louder than anything I'd been doing all month. I opened the door, and Greg was furious, yelling at me about how I needed to stop making noise, and that quiet hours started at 10 p.m. He said I was being rude and inconsiderate, going on and on, but honestly, I hadn't been making any noise besides the usual sounds of living. The banging he was talking about? It was me closing my car door when I got home. That set the tone for how things were going to be between us. Every time I came home late from work, he'd get upset, complaining that me shutting my car door was waking him up. I tried to explain to him that I couldn't control my work schedule, and maybe he should try closing his windows at night if the noise was bothering him so much. He absolutely hated that suggestion. A couple of months later, Greg shows up at my door again, but this time he's holding 2 margaritas. He had this fake, overly friendly vibe, and kept saying how he wanted to make peace, that we had started off on the wrong foot. But something felt really off about it. He seemed almost too excited, like he was hiding something. I reluctantly agreed that if we had any issues, we could just talk like normal adults. He agreed a little too quickly and kept pushing the second margarita into my hand, insisting that I drink it. I was barely of legal drinking age at the time and didn't like accepting drinks from people I didn't know well, so I tried to refuse. But he practically shoved the drink into my hand. Greg then pushed me to drink it as a sort of toast to our new beginning. I pretended to take a sip, but the whole thing was making my skin crawl. As soon as I could, I ended the conversation, locked the door behind me, and dumped the drink down the sink. The more I thought about it, the more I felt certain he had tried to drug me. The thought of what could have happened if I had actually drunk it makes me sick to this day. I'm beyond relieved that he's gone now. Greg, wherever you are, let's never cross paths again. My husband and I have been in this house for about 12 years now. We moved to this spot mainly because it was known to be super quiet and the schools were top-notch. Our daughter Mia, who's just turned 8, loves running around outside with a few of the neighborhood kids. She's got a solid group of 4 or 5 friends here, and honestly, they're all great kids with friendly parents. Across the street, there's this elderly couple, and my husband and I jokingly call them the watchdogs of the neighborhood. Somehow they always seem to know what's going on, from neighborhood drama to local news. I'm not sure how they manage to get all that information, but they're really sweet people. Still, it's like they have a radar for anything happening around here. Anyway, the folks who used to live right next door to us moved out, but we hadn't met or heard anything about the new people who moved in about a week ago. One evening, I was outside in the yard kicking a ball with Mia when I noticed the older woman from across the street pulling into her driveway. Mia and I waved at her, and she wandered over to say hello, as she often does. Since I was curious about the new neighbors, I asked if she had any details about who had moved in. She mentioned that it was a single man, probably in his late 60s, named Harold, who used to teach before retiring. Other than that, she didn't know much. None of us had really seen the guy since the day he moved in, hauling boxes from a truck. We both agreed to keep each other updated if either of us saw or spoke to him. Time passed, though, and nobody in the area had caught a glimpse of him. Then, one evening, Mia was out playing with a couple of her friends, and the sun was almost gone. I stepped outside to tell them it was time to pack up and head home. Mia's friends waved goodbye and ran off, and we went back inside. I casually asked Mia how her evening went, and what she told me sent a chill down my spine. She said she had met the new neighbor earlier that day. Apparently, he had come out while they were passing by his place on the way to her friend's house. He walked down his driveway and asked if the girls wanted to come in for lemonade. Thankfully, Mia and her friends were smart enough to decline and keep walking, but the whole thing left me feeling uneasy. I quickly texted the lady across the street to let her know something was off. We needed to be on alert. When Mia told my husband what had happened, he lost it. He threw on his shoes and stormed out the door, heading straight for Harold's house. I told Mia to stay inside and rushed after him. Harold's lights were on, and his car was parked right in the driveway. But even after my husband pounded on the door for what felt like ages, there was no response. We knew he was in there. If it had been someone we were familiar with, someone we trusted, we wouldn't have been so upset. But this was a stranger, and he had seriously overstepped. Word spread fast through the neighborhood. I ended up talking to the other parents whose kids played with Mia, and we all agreed we'd keep a close eye on the situation, especially when our kids were outside. But it wasn't long before something else happened. One evening, I was making dinner when I got a call from Mia's friend's mom. Mia had been over at their place for a playdate. "Hey, you need to come over right away. Everyone's okay, but we need to talk," she said, sounding uneasy. My heart sank. I grabbed my keys and drove a few houses down, barely remembering to park before rushing up to their door. The parents met me at the entrance, looking nervous. I stepped inside, and they invited me to sit down in the living room. Mia and the other girls were downstairs in the basement, oblivious to what had just happened. The mom started explaining that the girls had been playing in the front yard, and she'd been out there with them the entire time. She only went inside for a few minutes to get dinner started, and that's when Harold showed up, walking his dog. He let the girls pet the dog, which seemed harmless enough at first. But when the mom came back outside, she saw him crouching down, inches away from Mia, snapping a picture of her with his phone. She ran back inside to get her husband, and they both confronted him. To their shock, Harold didn't back down. He denied taking any photos, got defensive, and acted like he hadn't done anything wrong. They told him to leave immediately and brought the girls inside before calling me. As soon as I got home, I called my husband at work and told him everything. We decided we needed to take action and ended up filing a restraining order against Harold. But honestly, it didn't make much of a difference. He still lived right next door. The order might have been on paper, but it didn't make us feel any safer. We've lived in this house for over a decade, and moving wasn't something we wanted to consider. But after that night, my husband and I had no choice. Every morning, when I walk Mia to the bus stop, I catch him watching from his window, his gaze following us. It's beyond unsettling. I know he won't stop, and it's just not safe for Mia here anymore. Back in the fall of 2001, when I had just turned 15, my family relocated to a quiet little town nestled in the mountains of Oregon. It didn't take long for me to bond with the only other teen around my age living nearby, a guy named Ethan. Late one afternoon, right as spring was creeping up, Ethan and I had been exploring the thick woods behind our homes when we stumbled upon a thin creek winding its way through the trees. We were bored out of our minds, so naturally we jumped right in and started swimming against the current, just goofing around. We kept at it for hours, and even though the sky began to darken, we weren't ready to stop. Instead of heading home, we tossed our stuff on the riverbank and kept swimming. Maybe 10 minutes later, Ethan suddenly got quiet, then motioned for me to come closer. Once I was near enough, he leaned in and whispered, "Take a look behind me, near the tree line. I think someone's walking back and forth." At first I was going to brush it off as him just being paranoid, but the tension in his voice made me pause. I glanced over his shoulder, scanning the line of trees for a bit, but didn't spot anything unusual. I mumbled something like, "It's probably just an animal, or maybe the light's playing tricks. Nobody else comes around here, man. This place is basically hidden." That didn't seem to calm him down. Ethan turned back toward the trees, and there was a weird silence between us. Then he spoke again. "Did you hear that?" he asked quietly. I shook my head, telling him I hadn't heard a thing. But Ethan was clearly spooked. He asked if I'd get out of the water and check it out with him. I didn't feel like leaving the water and told him as much. I figured if I got out now, I wouldn't want to get back in, and I was still in the mood to swim. Ethan didn't push it. Instead, he swam toward the bank and climbed out. I stayed in the water, not realizing how stupid it was to dive into the dark where I couldn't see if there were any rocks. After a few minutes, though, an uneasy feeling crept up on me, and I suddenly felt very much alone. I looked back at the bank, but Ethan wasn't there anymore. The 2 flashlights we had brought were still lying in the sand near our shoes, untouched. I called out for Ethan as I clambered out of the water, but there was no answer. Grabbing my flashlight, I flicked it on and swept the beam across the trees. "Ethan!" I shouted again, thinking maybe he was trying to scare me, but all I got back was the quiet rustling of the leaves. I took a few steps toward the woods, feeling a little uneasy now. Right where Ethan had been looking earlier, I saw something. He was standing there, his back to me, just staring into the darkness between the trees. It was weird. I walked up behind him, close enough that he should have heard me, but he didn't even flinch. "Ethan! What the hell, man? Why are you ignoring me?" I said, my voice louder than I intended. I reached out to tap his shoulder, but before I could, he raised his hand, shaky and slow, and pointed into the shadows. "Do you see that?" he whispered. "What is that?" I swung my flashlight toward his face. He looked terrified, his skin pale like he'd just seen a ghost, and his eyes were wide, almost bulging out. One detail that still sticks with me was this small trickle of blood running from his nose. Barely noticing it at the moment, I turned the beam to where he was pointing. "What are you talking about?" I asked, confused. Then everything seemed to freeze. The light hit something, a pair of legs in dark pants just standing there in the woods. My heart lurched. The flashlight felt so heavy all of a sudden, like I could barely hold it. I should have quickly moved the light up to see who it was, but I couldn't. I felt like something was holding me back. Slowly, I raised the beam, revealing more. There was a torso. Then, as I lifted the light higher, I saw a face. That smile. It stretched way too wide, showing gums and teeth in a way that felt all wrong, like something out of a nightmare. I freaked out. My body went into full panic mode. The flashlight slipped from my hands, clattering onto the ground. In my rush to turn and run, I crashed into Ethan, and we both tumbled down. "Run!" I screamed at him. I bolted like a madman, tearing through the woods, following the same path we'd taken earlier. My mind was racing, barely processing anything except the need to run. I lost count of how many times I stumbled, maybe 5 or 6. But each time I hit the ground, I scrambled back up and kept going, pushing myself forward through the trees. The only light guiding me came from the faint stars above and the distant glow of the house through the gaps in the branches. I didn't yell for Ethan. I didn't need to. I was sure I could hear him just behind me, thrashing through the undergrowth as frantically as I was. I burst through the garage and into the kitchen, screaming my head off. My arms were scratched up, my face scraped, and at some point I had even lost one of my shoes. But none of that registered. All I could do was beg my parents to call the cops. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I glanced behind me, expecting to see Ethan, but he wasn't there. I figured he must have headed back to his own house, so I told my parents to call his family once the police got there. When the cops arrived, I was shaking so bad they thought I was on something. My parents had to convince them I wasn't, but I could barely talk, let alone explain what had happened. Then the phone rang. It was Ethan's parents, asking if he'd come home with me. My stomach dropped. The police organized a search team, bringing in dogs and more officers to scour the area. They found our stuff by the river, our shoes, the flashlights, but there was no sign of Ethan or that thing. The search went on for months. They combed through over 100 miles of forest, but Ethan had just vanished, like he'd never been there at all. There were a few news stories about it, but in a small town like ours, where people go missing in the woods all the time, it didn't really spread far. What kills me the most is that his family never got any answers. They're still waiting, hoping for something, even though deep down, they probably know he's gone. I carry that weight with me every single day. The guilt of not stopping, of not making sure he was right behind me, gnaws at me constantly. I can still hear his footsteps in my head, those heavy, panicked steps following mine as we ran. I don't know when he stopped, or if something caught him before he could make it out. But there's another thought that haunts me. Something I can't shake. What if it wasn't Ethan I heard running behind me that night? We had this neighbor when I was around 14 or so, and I didn't know the whole story until much later. But he was the main reason we left that house. My dad swears it all started when the guy began some weird project in his backyard shed. Of course, it was his place, so he could do whatever he wanted during the day, but the constant banging and sawing really got on my dad's nerves. He figured it was just a short-term thing, maybe a couple of days at most, but it dragged on for over a week. The noise didn't stop after work hours or even on weekends, sometimes going late into the night. After a while, my dad had enough and warned him he'd call the police if it kept up. That sounds harsh, I know, but apparently, Dad had already asked politely a few times, and the guy just ignored him. So, the threat seemed to be the only thing that worked. After that, the guy toned it down a bit, keeping the noise to more reasonable hours. It was still annoying, but nothing my dad couldn't handle. Then, one day, my dad saw something odd. He was peeking over the fence and saw our neighbor hauling a bunch of chains into the shed. Not long after, he brought out what looked like heavy-duty shackles, the kind you'd see in a movie where someone gets locked up. Naturally, Dad asked what he was doing, but the guy just brushed him off, muttering something like, "Stay out of it." That's when my dad started getting seriously freaked out. He thought about calling the cops right then, not only to report the strange behavior, but maybe to put an end to the constant hammering. But he hesitated, and that's when things got really bad. One night, Dad heard a scream coming from the neighbor's yard. It wasn't just a regular scream. It was the kind that makes your stomach drop. He ran outside to get a better listen and caught more muffled sounds coming from the shed. He tried to see over the fence again, and that's when he spotted our neighbor walking out of the shed, smeared with blood, holding something shiny and sharp. Just before he slammed the door shut, Dad swears he saw a person strapped to a large wooden board inside. That was it for my dad. He ran back inside and dialed the cops, telling them something really disturbing was going down in our neighbor's yard. He explained how the guy had been building what looked like some twisted torture setup, and that he thought the guy was in the middle of, well, killing someone. The police showed up, but after a brief chat with the guy, they just drove off like nothing serious was happening. My dad was furious. He called them back, asking what they were doing, saying they needed to check the shed because there was definitely something awful happening in there. But the cops told him they couldn't search the place without a warrant. The guy had some bandages on his hand and claimed the blood was from a work-related injury. The cops were satisfied with that explanation and left, promising they'd work on getting a warrant because my dad had reported seeing what looked like a body. They said it could take a few hours to get a judge to sign off on it. Then, early the next morning, around 5:30 or 6, the police came back. This time, they didn't waste any time. My dad was woken up by the sound of them cutting the lock off the shed door. He stood by the window, watching as they worked all morning, and finally, they pulled out the body my dad had seen. But it wasn't what anyone thought. It was a mannequin, covered in fake blood. Turns out the guy really had been building some creepy torture table, but it wasn't for any real person. He hadn't harmed anyone. The police ended up apologizing to the guy since they found no reason to charge him with anything. But my dad couldn't shake the feeling of living next to someone who would even want to build something like that. After going back and forth with the police, arguing about the guy's rights to construct such weird stuff on his own property, my dad finally said, "You know what? Forget this. We're moving." He didn't tell us kids at the time, probably because I was still pretty young, and he didn't want to freak me and my sister out. But years later, after I'd moved out and my sister had finished college, he brought it up at a family dinner. You can imagine our shock when he told us the real reason we had to leave that house. My sister and I always thought it was just because of some work thing or that Dad was tired of the neighborhood. It came up because we were reminiscing about how hard it had been to switch schools, especially since we'd both made great friends, only to lose them when we had to start over somewhere else. Dad thought telling us the truth would finally make sense of why we had to move. And honestly, I get it. I wouldn't have wanted to live next to a guy like that either. I used to rent a small apartment on the first floor of a 12-story building. It wasn't fancy, but it was affordable for a young guy like me. The building had a bunch of other units with balconies, but since I was on the ground floor, my place didn't have one. I did, however, have 2 wide windows that faced southeast, which meant I got a lot of morning sunlight. That was nice in the winter, but it got brutal in the summer since the building didn't have any air conditioning. I'd been living there for about a year when this incident happened, and despite the time, I hadn't really met many of the neighbors. The place had a weird vibe. Everyone kept to themselves. I was working an office job downtown, so between my hour-long commute and long shifts, I didn't spend much time at home. There was one guy I noticed, though. He lived at the other end of the hall. I'd see him every now and then going in or out, but we'd never spoken. He seemed older than me. I was 26 at the time, and he looked to be in his mid-50s. He was short, maybe a bit under 5.5 feet, but solidly built, like he was used to hard work. My apartment was pretty cramped. It was just one room with a small bathroom, kitchen shoved in the corner, and my bed next to one of the windows. You could call it a studio, but that makes it sound nicer than it was. The hallway to the front door had closets on both sides, but otherwise, it was all open space. I'd gotten used to it, and was just doing my usual thing one Friday night after hanging out with some friends. It was around 10 p.m. when I got home. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, I saw that neighbor of mine standing at the far end, staring in my direction. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was weird, but I brushed it off, unlocked my door, and went inside. I wasn't scared, just a bit uneasy. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet. About 10 minutes later, I was brushing my teeth, getting ready to crash for the night. That's when I heard the doorknob jiggle. I froze, toothpaste still in my mouth, and waited. It wasn't loud, but someone was definitely messing with the knob. My heart started racing as I tiptoed to the door and peeked through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I hesitated for a second, then slowly opened the door and glanced out. That same neighbor was walking back toward his apartment. As I stepped out a bit further, he turned around and locked eyes with me for just a second before I quickly ducked back inside. I knew he saw me, though. I spent the rest of the night trying to convince myself he'd just gotten confused and thought my door was his. But something about the way he looked back at me made it hard to believe that. At first I told myself it was just a fluke. It was late, maybe he'd been drinking, and Friday nights could get rowdy in this building. Those explanations felt reasonable at the time. But a month later, things took a turn. The heat that night was brutal. And even with my windows open as wide as they'd go, my apartment felt like an oven. The fan was whirling above me at full blast, and the noise from the street outside mixed with the fan's hum, making it hard to hear much else. I crashed around 11 p.m., trying to ignore the racket and fall asleep. I woke up a few times, like usual. Once, it was the sound of sirens blaring that startled me. But the second time I opened my eyes, I noticed something far more disturbing. There was a figure standing at the foot of my bed. I froze for a split second, then shouted every curse word I could think of and scrambled for my phone. The light switch was across the room, so I used the flashlight on my phone to see. My stomach dropped when the beam hit the guy. It was the same neighbor from down the hall. Before I could even react, he lunged at me. We tumbled onto the floor, grappling in the dark. He was stronger than I expected, pinning me down, and I could feel panic setting in. My hands fumbled around, searching for anything I could use to defend myself. Finally, I got hold of a small dumbbell I kept under my bed. With all the strength I had, I swung it at his head, hitting him hard on the side. He went limp and slumped on top of me. I managed to wriggle out from under him and bolted out of my apartment without even stopping to put on shoes. Once I got outside, I called the cops. When they arrived, we went back inside together, but the guy was gone. I told them what happened, described the neighbor, and pointed out his apartment. They knocked on his door, but there was no response. He had vanished. The police couldn't do much with just my story. There wasn't enough proof for them to force their way in. The next morning, I went to the building management and had them check the security footage. The lobby camera caught me fleeing, but oddly enough, it didn't show my neighbor at all. I realized he must have slipped out through my window, which I'd left open that night, and that's probably how he got in too. With no solid evidence and no clear shot of him, the guy got away with it. I was now living just a few doors down from someone who had tried to attack me. It was terrifying. I packed up and moved out within a week, found another apartment across town, and never looked back. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up when I did. Hopefully, he never found someone else to terrorize. There have been quite a few times in my life where things could have been different if I wasn't so obsessed with being polite. It's like I'm hardwired to avoid being rude, even when it's not in my best interest. This is one of those situations that might have never happened if I just stopped being so nice. Now, let me clarify. Nothing truly dangerous happened, no threats or attacks. But it was definitely creepy, and it could have easily spiraled into something worse. It all started with this older guy who lived nearby. I always felt kind of sorry for him, mostly because he seemed so alone. You'd never see anyone visiting him. At first, he'd hug me every time we met. I didn't think much of it. Where I come from, hugging as a greeting isn't exactly weird. After a while, he asked for my phone number, saying he had health issues, something about a stroke a few years back and his wife having problems too. He said they both were prone to falls and might need someone to call in case of an emergency. I figured it wouldn't hurt to help out, so I gave him my number. I mean, what if my grandparents needed help? I'd want someone to step in for them. So, at first, it was just the occasional knock on my door, offering me some food he had left over, which seemed pretty nice. But then, it started to get weird. He began showing up almost every day, ringing my doorbell until I answered. There was one time he hit the bell 6 times in a row. And then, out of nowhere, he just walked into my apartment one day when I opened the door. He didn't stop there either. He took off his shirt to show me a scar on his chest, which I really didn't need to see. I tried telling him I believed he had a scar without needing the whole demonstration, but he wasn't hearing it. He took off his shirt anyway. It didn't stop there either. If he didn't see me around for more than a day, he'd call, asking where I was and what I was up to. He had started hugging me more too, but this time it got uncomfortable. He'd rock from side to side or bounce a little when he hugged me, and I didn't know how to handle it. I'd make excuses like, "Oh, I might be coming down with something," just to avoid the physical contact. This was all before COVID, but I figured the sickness excuse would work to keep him away. Then, things got really weird. 3 things happened, each on different days, and even now, they make my skin crawl when I think about them. The first one happened when he put his hands on the sides of my head. He squeezed gently, ran his fingers through my hair, and started pulling my head closer to his. I put my hand on his shoulder and pushed him away, but the whole thing was just unsettling. I told him straight up that I'm not really into being touched like that. Honestly, that wasn't even true, but I needed an excuse at the moment. The second time it got weird, I had just managed to pull away from one of his awkward hugs when he ran his fingers through my hair. I told him again, trying to be firm, that I wasn't the kind of person who liked getting all touchy-feely. But the last thing he did really crossed the line for me. He hugged me, like normal this time. No creepy bouncing or rocking. But then, out of nowhere, he stroked my face and pinched my nose. I felt this gross, uncomfortable feeling spread through me, so I quickly backed off, making up some excuse about needing to get back to work. He didn't let it go, though. He grabbed my arm, not roughly, but firm enough to make me uneasy, and tried to pull me into another hug. I shook him off and told him again, as clearly as I could, that I didn't want any more hugs. Each of these weird interactions happened in my apartment, not out on the street where someone could see. That made it feel even worse. After the last time, I made up my mind. He wasn't getting close to me again. His behavior seemed like it was escalating bit by bit, and I didn't want to find out where that would end. From that point on, whenever I saw him coming while I was out walking my dog, I'd turn and go the other way as fast as possible. I didn't want any more conversations or weird hugs. Eventually, he noticed I was avoiding him. One day, he followed me back to my apartment and asked me if he had done something wrong. I just told him, "Look, I don't like being touched, but you keep doing it anyway, and it makes me uncomfortable." His response? "I wish you would have told me." I had told him, more than once. And yet, he acted like this was the first time he was hearing it. He still tries to talk to me when I'm out with my dog, but now I just completely ignore him. There's something I've realized from all this. Some people, especially older ones, take advantage of the assumptions we make. I assumed I should be nice and social with him because he was old and lonely. I assumed that, because he seemed frail, nothing bad could really come of it. And maybe I'm overreacting, but I don't think I am. So, why do I keep saying I should have been less polite? It's because, deep down, I knew something was off way before those 3 moments. I felt weird when he wouldn't stop ringing my doorbell, and I hated it when he'd call me over and over. That dancing hug? It made me cringe, but I told myself I was being rude if I said anything. I ignored my gut because I didn't want to look like the bad guy by being impolite to an old man. From now on, I'm still going to be kind, but I'm not going to put politeness over my own comfort. If something feels wrong, I'm going to listen to that feeling. I moved into my first place about 5 months ago. My uncle has a bunch of properties around here, and since I turned 19, he's been letting me stay in one of them. It's a small, 1-floor house on a quiet street not far from a busy road. The homes around it are pretty close together, but at least the backyards have some space. I haven't gotten to know any of the neighbors, though. Most seem to stay in their own lane, which is fine by me. For the first couple of months, everything was going smoothly until I came home late one Tuesday night. It had been snowing all day, and I dreaded having to shovel the driveway when I got back. I was beat from work, but there was no one else to handle it. I'm the youngest of 4, with 3 older sisters, and I used to guilt them into doing chores like this for me. Now that I was on my own, I bundled up and got ready to head out right after walking through the door. I let out my 4-year-old mutt Max to join me in the snow. Max loves snow more than anything, and as soon as his paws hit the cold ground, he started bouncing around in excitement. He wears one of those electric collars to keep him from wandering off, so I don't worry much when he's out with me. As I was clearing snow, I noticed the guy from across the street, someone I hadn't met yet, coming outside with his snowblower. He spotted me right away and headed over. I paused what I was doing and greeted him. He introduced himself as Matt, shaking my hand. He was tall, kind of thin, and wearing a red knit beanie. "Mind if I help you out with that driveway?" he asked. I politely declined, but he didn't take no for an answer and brought his snowblower over anyway. I appreciated the gesture and thanked him as we worked together. Once we wrapped up, he offered to come inside for a coffee or some tea, but I turned him down with another thank you. Matt seemed like a good enough guy, but something about him didn't quite sit right. It wasn't anything specific he did, just something off. Like his actions and his vibe didn't match up. He didn't show much emotion, but he'd crack weird jokes and laugh at odd moments. I figured he was just socially awkward, and honestly, after helping with the whole driveway, I couldn't complain. I headed back inside with Max, took a shower, and settled on the couch to binge something on Netflix. After a while, I was drifting off to sleep, so I let Max out one last time before bed. The snow kept coming down hard, and the wind made it feel a lot colder than it actually was. I noticed Matt's house across the street was pitch dark. No outdoor lights or anything, which felt strange in this weather. His garage door was shut, but there was this faint light coming from the tiny windows on the garage door. I hadn't really gotten to know the people on this street yet, so I didn't think much of it. I went back to my room and crashed. A few hours later, I woke up to this loud noise outside. I groggily reached for my phone. It was 3 a.m. Still half asleep, I peeked out from behind the curtains and couldn't believe what I saw. Matt was back outside, plowing my driveway again. His garage was open, and the light inside was shining across my driveway, lighting up the whole scene. It was way too late for that kind of thing, so I threw on my shoes and went to the front porch. I tried waving to get his attention whenever he turned my way, but it was like he didn't even notice me standing there with the porch light on. I walked down the driveway, still trying to get his attention, but he just kept going, like I wasn't even there. When I got close enough, he finally stopped and looked up at me. His face looked confused, like he hadn't seen me until that very moment. I told him, "Hey, can you stop? It's too late for this. People are trying to sleep." He gave me this look like I'd just insulted him and said, "Oh, okay, sure. You're welcome, I guess." His reaction was weird, almost like he was offended, but I didn't lose my cool. I thanked him politely and headed back to the house. As I closed the door behind me, I caught a glimpse of him walking back down the driveway, but this time, he wasn't done. He had a shovel in his hand. I stepped back outside, trying to keep my cool, and asked him if he could stop for the night. What he said next really shook me. He froze, stared at me for a long moment, then muttered, "You're gonna regret that." His words left me speechless. I quickly stepped back into the house, locked the door behind me, and felt my heart pounding. Max was standing by the door, barking like crazy. He knew something wasn't right. I decided to let him sleep in my room that night, instead of leaving him in the living room like usual. Before heading to bed, I took another peek out the window. Matt was gone. His garage was shut, the lights were off, and his house looked like a black void again. Trying to shake off the weird vibe, I got into bed and scrolled through my phone, hoping to relax. But just as I was starting to settle in, my phone rang. The number was blocked. That sent a chill down my spine. I didn't pick up and let it go to voicemail. A few seconds later, the notification popped up. I hesitated but pressed play. It was just static at first, and then heavy breathing. Breathing. The message lasted maybe 10 seconds, but nobody said anything. It was too creepy to be a random coincidence. I couldn't stop thinking about Matt. That night, sleep didn't come easy. The wind howled outside, rattling the house, and every little sound made me jump. By morning, I was exhausted, but still had to drag myself to work. As I was taking the trash out, I noticed footprints in the snow along the side of the house. They weren't mine. That awful feeling from last night came rushing back, and I followed the tracks. They led around the house, up onto the deck, and right up to the back door. Then they circled every window and door before looping back to the front. I knew it had to be him. No one else would do something like this. My stomach dropped. I ran back inside, grabbed my phone, and called my uncle, telling him everything that had happened. He came over right away, helped me pack up my stuff, and I moved out that very day. We thought about calling the cops, but in the end, we decided against it. The last thing I wanted was to make Matt even angrier. I was more than happy to leave and never look back. I live in a small town, and right across from my place is this cul-de-sac. It leads straight to a forest that seems to stretch on endlessly. The trees there are thick, and the bushes grow wild, making it pretty easy to lose your way if you're not careful. When I was a kid, around 9 or 10, I used to ride my bike all the time through the paths in the woods. The way home was fun since the road sloped slightly downhill, and it felt like you were flying. One afternoon, I was biking down towards the cul-de-sac, the sun hanging low. The forest entrance was clear from the street, and as I neared it, something caught my eye. Someone stood deep in the woods, just beyond where the trees really started to close in. Not paying attention, I crashed into a car parked right outside one of the houses. I felt a little embarrassed, but luckily, I wasn't hurt. The person in the woods moved strangely, pacing in circles like they were confused or trying to make a decision. That's when I realized they were wearing a dark raincoat. Their hood was down, and I could see the man was older, probably in his mid-40s, with patches of thinning hair. I could hear him mumbling to himself, though I couldn't make out what he was saying. Feeling uneasy, I crouched behind the car I'd just hit, peeking just over the trunk to keep an eye on him. As he walked, something in his hand caught the light. It shimmered every time he stepped into a beam of sunlight that made it through the trees. It was a knife. Even from where I was crouched, I could see it had this reddish stain on the blade. My heart started racing, and I scrambled to pick up my bike. I was ready to bolt home, but when I glanced back, I froze in place. The man had stopped pacing and was now staring directly at me. His eyes locked onto mine. I freaked out, dropped behind the car again, accidentally letting my bike crash to the ground. The clattering sound echoed down the empty street. I stayed there, huddled behind the car, holding my breath. I didn't dare move for what felt like forever, but it was probably only about 20 or 30 seconds. Slowly, I peeked out from behind the car again. The guy was still standing there, just staring at me. And then, without warning, he started running toward me, screaming like some kind of wild animal. I was out of there in a heartbeat, launching myself back onto my bike, pedaling harder than I ever had before. As I reached the end of the street, I risked a glance back. He had stopped chasing me, just calmly walking back into the trees like nothing had happened. By the time I got home, I was shaken but didn't say a word about it. I didn't want to freak out my parents or my brother, and honestly, I was more worried that they'd ban me from riding my bike down that way again. I guess being a kid, I didn't think too clearly about what had just happened. It's been nearly 12 years now, and nothing ever came of it. No news about missing people or anything weird happening in our town. I still wonder sometimes who that guy was. Maybe he was just some messed up loner, or maybe he was high on something. Whatever his deal was, I'm just glad I never found out what he planned to do with that knife. I'm 25 and live with my friend, a 22-year-old girl, in a small apartment on the outskirts of Denver. Denver's not the safest place right now, with crime rates spiking, so we made sure to get a Ring camera and a keypad lock for extra security. About 5 months ago, the Peters family from next door moved out, and in their place came a new neighbor. His name's Steve, and, well, he's different. The day we saw him unloading, we were both stunned by how much junk he was trying to cram into his tiny apartment. It was all anime figures and old movie props, definitely gave off some pack rat vibes, but not really our concern. Once the moving trucks were gone, and a few days passed, we decided to knock on his door to drop off a welcome basket. You know, the usual. Some cookies, dog treats, because he has a little terrier, and scented candles. In hindsight, this probably wasn't the best idea. Things started to get weird after that. At first, it was little stuff. Steve would pop his head out of the door whenever he heard us come or go, making small talk. Or he'd knock on our door asking to borrow sugar, coffee filters, or even paper towels. Then, he began asking us to dog sit for a bit, but over the past couple of weeks, it got a lot more uncomfortable. 2 weekends back, we had been out bar hopping around downtown Denver. We got home around 2:30 a.m. and found Steve sitting right at the top of the stairs, waiting. He seemed irritated, asking why we were out so late and telling us we should have let him know if we were going to be out past midnight. I couldn't help but laugh, like, who does this guy think he is? But then he snapped and called me a brainless Stacy, and honestly, I'm still not even sure what that means. Then he asked if we'd share access to our Ring camera so he could keep an eye on us and make sure we were safe. We couldn't help but burst out laughing, told him no, and went inside. But things got really unsettling the next day. We checked the footage, and it showed Steve sitting outside his apartment the whole night, just staring at our door. It was beyond creepy. We decided to let the building management know what was going on, and they just told us to get in touch with the police. So we did. Unfortunately, the cops couldn't do much. They said that since we all lived in the same building, they couldn't intervene unless he either made direct threats or tried to enter our apartment. It was so frustrating. I guess the management must have spoken to him because he backed off for the next week. But that didn't last. This past week, it's like Steve's lost his mind. He's been sitting outside our place constantly, like he's waiting for us. My roommate even started leaving for work super early just to avoid running into him. I, on the other hand, feel trapped. I can't leave during the day without him lurking right outside. He's asked me out multiple times, left weird love notes on our door, cars, and even in our mailbox. The scariest part? When I told him I wasn't interested, he said he'd hurt himself if I didn't agree to go out with him. But of course, he didn't put that in writing, so the police still can't do anything about it. As if that wasn't enough, he installed his own Ring camera, aimed right at our door, tracking our every move. And now he's leaving us disgusting sexual notes whenever we're not home, so we find them when we get back. Honestly, I don't know what else to do. It feels like something terrible is brewing, and I'm scared it's only a matter of time before things get worse. This happened when I was about 14, and back then, I lived with my mom, dad, and my younger brother, Tim. Tim was 2 years behind me in school, so he must have been 12 at the time. We lived on the outskirts of a small town, more like a rural area than anything. It wasn't fancy, but the houses were spaced out, with big lawns separating each one. Mom worked long hours and wouldn't be home until evening, usually a few hours after Tim and I got back from school. Dad traveled often for work, and was away nearly half the month. He happened to be out of town when this all went down. We had this neighbor, Steve, who lived a few houses down. He was probably in his mid-50s, lived alone, and was kind of the go-to guy for small jobs around the block. Steve would sometimes help us out with yard work or small repairs, especially when Dad was away. He wasn't talkative, but always seemed friendly when we ran into him. One afternoon, just like any other, Tim and I were hanging out in the living room, flipping through TV channels. We were sitting on the couch, bickering over what to watch. Being the older one, I had control of the remote, and Tim was too small to take it from me, so it was really my call. I settled on a rerun of some old cartoon we both liked. As we were getting into the show, I saw someone coming up the driveway. The front window was right next to the couch, so you could easily see who was walking up to the door. Before I had time to react, there was a knock. I glanced out and saw Steve standing there. Thinking it was just a quick visit, maybe for some favor or to collect on something Mom owed him, I opened the door a little. Before I could say much, Steve pushed his way in without a word. He walked right past me, heading straight for the living room. I followed him, confused, trying to figure out what he wanted. Tim was still on the couch, staring at Steve with wide eyes, obviously freaked out. Then, without warning, Steve grabbed Tim by the arm and started dragging him toward the front door. It felt unreal, watching this guy we'd always thought was just a quiet, harmless neighbor now yanking my brother Tim out of our house. I shouted for Tim to get away or do something, but Steve was too strong and Tim didn't even get a chance. He seemed frozen in shock. Steve dragged him toward the front door while I screamed, trying to stop it. I grabbed at the back of Tim's shirt, pulling with all I had, and even tried kicking Steve, but it was like I wasn't even there. The guy was huge, and both of us together couldn't stop him. They were almost out the door when I ran out into the yard. It was still broad daylight, and there were a few people outside. I screamed as loud as I could, hoping someone would notice. Sure enough, a neighbor across the street looked over. He was mowing his lawn and shut off the mower when he saw us. He started walking toward our house, clearly concerned. As soon as Steve noticed the guy coming over, he stopped and let go of Tim. My brother scrambled behind me. The neighbor, confused, asked what was going on. Steve, suddenly calm, began talking fast, trying to explain. He came up with some excuse, saying he was just trying to help and didn't know why Tim was freaking out. The neighbor glanced between all of us, clearly unsure of what to believe. Somehow, Steve's story seemed to calm him down, though he still looked confused. Steve walked off, heading back to his place like nothing happened, and the neighbor shrugged it off and went back to mowing his lawn. Tim and I stood there in our driveway, stunned, trying to make sense of everything. We were just kids, and at that age, it's easy to think adults know best, so as crazy as it sounds, part of us wondered if Steve really thought he was doing the right thing. We went back inside, making sure to lock the door behind us. We sat on the couch, not saying a word, not even looking at the TV anymore, just waiting for Mom to get home. When she did, we told her everything. Steve later made up some weird story about thinking he saw a snake in our yard and was just trying to protect Tim. We do have rattlesnakes around here, but we were inside the house the whole time. He even denied coming inside, and since the other neighbor hadn't seen him enter, there wasn't much the police could do. It ended up being his word against ours, and since Tim wasn't hurt, the whole thing kind of just went away. Mom believed us though, and that was all that mattered. From that point on, we kept our distance from Steve, and he seemed to stay away from us too. But every time we saw him, there was always this feeling, like we were waiting for him to try something again. It was a sticky, humid night in the middle of August, and I was in my final year of college. For the first time ever, I was living by myself, since all my old roommates had finished school a year earlier. I'd found a small one-bedroom apartment in a big complex on the 3rd floor, with a balcony that faced a quiet courtyard. Below, there was a patch of overgrown grass separating my building from the parking lot. Sunday evening, I went to bed early, knowing I had work early the next morning. I'd been watching some shows on my tablet and powered it down at about 9:30 p.m. A few hours later, I woke up suddenly to the sound of distant shouting, followed by what sounded like firecrackers. I figured it was probably just my neighbors. The walls here were paper thin, and I could usually hear everything from the apartments next door, from their loud TVs to their occasional fights. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The sounds were too sharp, too real. I sat up and pressed my ear against the wall, but this time, the noise wasn't coming from my neighbors. A few seconds later, I heard a door slam somewhere in the building, followed by hurried footsteps running down the hallway outside my place. I cautiously made my way to the door and peered through the peephole, but the hall was empty. I was sure someone had just rushed past, though. Then, more noise came from the ceiling above me. Quick, heavy footsteps. It sounded like multiple people running, but the shouting had stopped by now. The whole thing was unnerving. I started throwing on clothes, thinking it might be a fire or some emergency. I glanced toward the window for any signs of smoke, but there was none. If it were a fire, surely the alarms would have gone off by now. I'd been through that before, and this was different. Still, something was wrong. Just then, the door down the hall opened again. This time, there wasn't any running. but slow, purposeful footsteps echoed toward my apartment from the right. I froze, listening intently as they grew closer. With a knot tightening in my stomach, I peeked through the peephole again, waiting for whoever it was to come into view. I heard my neighbor's doorknob rattle. Someone was trying to open it, jerking the handle violently for several seconds before giving up. The footsteps resumed, and soon I saw a figure step into view. It was a man, dressed in dark clothing, his face completely hidden under what looked like a motorcycle helmet, or maybe something meant for paintball. He was holding a gun, but I couldn't tell if it was real. He paused right in front of my door, just standing there, as if listening. I didn't move, barely breathing, praying he didn't know I was behind the door. My eyes darted to the deadbolt, double-checking that it was locked, just like it always was. Then, the doorknob rattled, and the man started pushing against it, hard. I knew the door would hold, just like it had for my neighbor, but that didn't stop the panic. What if he managed to kick it down? What if he fired through the door? I found myself stepping back, moving away as quietly as I could. Each step felt like I was putting more distance between us, but my heart was still racing. I wasn't sure if he had left, or if he was still standing there, waiting. When I reached the far side of my small room, I almost stumbled into the edge of my bed, and I froze, hoping he hadn't heard me. Around that time, the sound of sirens in the distance became louder. Hope flickered. Were they coming for us? I peered out the window, and within minutes, the parking lot below was filled with flashing blue and red lights. Despite the relief of seeing the police, I still felt trapped, unable to shake the fear that the intruder was still nearby. Desperate to get out, I slid open the balcony door and stepped outside. The ground below wasn't too far, and the thought of staying in the apartment for another second felt unbearable. I climbed over the railing, lowering myself carefully until my feet hit the grass below. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Before I could even stand up straight, I heard yelling, "Get down!" 3 officers, all with guns drawn, were shouting at me to hit the ground. My body reacted before my brain could catch up, and I dropped, my face pressed into the wet grass. They patted me down, asking questions I could barely process. After I explained what had happened, they finally let me stand. One of them told me I should have stayed in my apartment. Looking back, I realized they were right, but in the moment, all I could think about was escaping. I stood there with the cops for over an hour, still jumpy, even though they assured me everything was under control. Eventually, I saw them lead the gunman out in cuffs. They wouldn't let us back into the building that night, so I didn't bother getting a room or going anywhere else. I couldn't imagine sleeping after all that anyway. The next morning, I dragged myself to work, more out of habit than anything. Not that I got much done. I kept replaying the night in my head. Over the next few days, more details trickled out about the guy who'd caused all this chaos. Turned out he was one of the tenants in my building. I'd never spoken to him, didn't even recognize his name when I first heard it. The police showed me a photo of him, and I vaguely remembered seeing him around the building, maybe once or twice in passing. Apparently he'd fired 2 shots into one of the units upstairs. That must have been what woke me up. No one was hurt, but it wasn't for lack of trying. From what I heard, he'd walked right up to their door and fired through it. The whole situation felt eerily close to what had almost happened to me. I still think the only reason he didn't shoot at my door was because I'd stayed so quiet that he didn't realize anyone was inside. It's honestly a miracle that no one was hurt that night. With someone like that wandering the halls, anything could have happened. To me, or to any of the other people living there. I was living in a quiet neighborhood, a typical small town in Oregon, and this took place when I was 13. Oh, and I'm a girl. There was this weird situation with a boy named Jared, who lived a few houses down from me. I went to a regular public school nearby, but Jared went to a small private school a little closer to our homes, so we didn't cross paths that often at first. Back in those days, my friends and I mostly spent our weekends wandering around the area or hanging out in one of the parks scattered around town. One Saturday, I was with 2 of my friends, just strolling through the neighborhood, and we happened to walk by Jared's house. He was in the driveway, playing basketball by himself. I didn't think much of it at the time. We kept walking until we reached this tiny park just a block or so away. We plopped down on the grass and started chatting. After an hour or so, my friends had to leave. Their houses were in the opposite direction, so they went one way, and I headed home alone. As I was making my way back, I suddenly felt a hand grip my left shoulder. Startled, I spun around and found Jared standing right behind me. I just stood there, waiting for him to say something. When he finally spoke, the words that came out were disgusting. He spewed insults and horrible comments I didn't even know a kid our age could say. We'd barely interacted before, so I had no idea why he was acting this way. I stood frozen for a few seconds before I turned and ran off. I glanced back once, but Jared wasn't following me. Not that it mattered much, he knew where I lived anyway. My house was a split level with 2 floors. The upper floor had the bedrooms, and the lower was more of a basement area. It was just me and my parents at the time, since my older sister had moved out a couple of years earlier. That night, during dinner, I told my mom about the creepy encounter with Jared. I wasn't thinking about calling the cops or anything drastic, but I couldn't shake how unnerving it all was. I asked my mom not to talk to Jared's parents about it. I didn't want it getting out that I said anything. She promised to keep it to herself, but told me to let her know if something else happened. A few days later, I was walking home from school alone. My route passed by that small private school Jared attended, and sure enough, I spotted him walking behind me. I kept my pace steady, pretending not to notice, but he was getting closer. At one point, I couldn't take it anymore and broke into a jog. By the time I neared my house and glanced back, he had disappeared. I decided not to tell my mom this time. I didn't want to make her worry even more. The following weeks were quiet. I saw Jared around occasionally, but he didn't bother me. Out of curiosity, I asked a few classmates if they knew anything about him. One of the boys in my class had a friend who went to the same school as Jared. He told me Jared was a bit of a loner and always seemed to be in trouble. Apparently, he had been suspended a few times for fighting and other stuff. After hearing that, I became extra cautious. I tried to get rides home whenever I could, or at least walked with friends so I wouldn't be alone. A month passed with no real issues. Then, one weekend, my parents were going to be out of town for a night. It was a Saturday, and I invited a couple of friends over to keep me company. We hung out, watched some movies, and ate snacks. It was fun, but eventually, they had to leave. I asked my friend Kelly to stay over, but she had other plans, so I ended up being home alone. About 10 minutes after Kelly left, she sent me a text. She said she saw Jared walking down the street and that he seemed to be heading toward my house. I didn't think much of it at first. He lived nearby, so it wasn't strange for him to be out walking. It had been over a month since the last weird encounter, so I wasn't as freaked out as I used to be. Still, just to be sure, I got up and peeked out the window. I spotted someone standing across the street, hidden in the shadows, but I couldn't make out who it was. Being alone in the house made everything feel even creepier, and I wasn't sure what to do. I had an aunt living a few blocks away, so I figured I could call her if things got worse. After a while, the person finally walked off, so I tried to relax and went back to watching my movie. It was almost midnight by then, but I didn't feel like going to bed. Not long after, I heard a soft knock at one of the back windows. I got up to check, but no one was there. Then I heard another knock at a different window. I checked again. Nothing. This happened a few more times. It felt like someone was trying to mess with me, to freak me out. At first, I hoped it was one of my friends playing a prank, but deep down, I knew it had to be Jared. That's when I decided to call my aunt. I thought she could come pick me up, and I'd spend the night at her place. While I waited, the knocking turned into loud thumps, now coming from the back door. My heart raced as I peeked around the corner. I saw a figure standing there, though it was too dark to see clearly. The pounding got louder, and just as panic was about to set in, I saw my aunt's car pull into the driveway. Without hesitating, I bolted out the front door and jumped into her car. We drove to her place, just a few minutes away. I stayed with her until my parents came back. When I finally returned home, I was expecting to find something broken. Maybe the back door busted or a window shattered, but everything was intact. Nothing seemed out of place. Even though there wasn't any damage, I told my parents everything that had happened. They ended up talking to Jared's parents about it. From what I heard, they were surprisingly understanding. After that, Jared never bothered me again, but less than a year later, his family moved away. I still think about what he might have been capable of if they had stayed. That night, with him trying to break in, was the most terrified I've ever felt. It was just another dull day at school. The only thing keeping me going was knowing the weekend was right around the corner. No school tomorrow meant I could sleep in. As I neared my house, I noticed something weird. The garage door was wide open and the lights were on. Dad had left earlier for a work trip, so I figured he'd been rushing and forgot to close it. Not thinking much of it, I switched off the lights and shut the door. The house was empty. Mom had gone to visit a friend, so I had the whole place to myself. After playing video games and watching a movie, I got thirsty and headed to the kitchen for a drink. That's when I saw it. The garage lights were on again. At first, I brushed it off, thinking maybe Mom had popped in for something. But deep down, something felt off. I decided to check the garage again, and the moment I stepped inside, my stomach dropped. Every drawer in Dad's workbench was yanked open, and his tools were scattered everywhere. It looked like someone had been desperately searching for something. My first thought was Mom, but she had barely been home earlier, and I didn't remember her going anywhere near the garage. I was getting really freaked out by now. I didn't see anyone, so I locked the door behind me and tried to distract myself by watching TV. But then, from behind me, I heard the doorknob to the garage rattling. My heart pounded as I turned to see the knob twisting, like someone was trying to force it open. A wave of terror washed over me. Whoever was on the other side didn't stop. They started pounding on the door, screaming like a maniac. I bolted upstairs, grabbed my phone, and thought about calling the police. But instead, my instincts told me to just get out of the house. It wasn't until I paused, halfway to the back door, that I realized everything had gone dead silent downstairs. The banging and screaming had stopped completely. I raced back downstairs, heading for the front door. In hindsight, I should have gone out the back, but panic had already taken over. As soon as I stepped into the living room, I froze. There he was, the intruder. He was huge, easily over 6 feet, and in his hand was one of Dad's axes from the garage. His back was to me, and he seemed to be checking behind an old armchair in the corner, like he was looking for something, or someone. Luckily, the TV was still playing loudly enough that he didn't hear me sneak in. I knew running upstairs again wasn't an option. I'd be cornered. So without making a sound, I turned around and quietly made my way toward the back door. Once I was outside, I sprinted down the street, my hands shaking as I dialed the police. They said they'd be there in 5 minutes, though those 5 minutes felt like an eternity. I ended up at my neighbor's house, Mr. Barnes, my dad's good friend. He didn't ask any questions, just let me in and waited with me until the cops arrived. When they finally showed up, they did a full sweep of the house. Just like I'd feared, the guy was gone. The officers told me the garage door had been hacked up pretty badly. He'd used the axe to break through the flimsy door that led into the house. Mom got home not long after, frantic when she heard what had happened. She pulled me into a hug, relieved I was safe. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread, though, wondering how the garage door got left open in the first place. Maybe Dad had just forgotten, or maybe the guy had found a way in. Either way, it's a chilling reminder that you can never be too careful. Make sure your doors are locked because you never know what's lurking out there. When I was 12, I lived in a neighborhood that was far from safe. Every night you could hear the sound of car engines revving down the streets, gunshots echoing in the distance, and fights breaking out in alleyways. I even got roped into a fight once, but after I didn't go back, I basically stopped leaving my house. With all that going on, I was terrified to be home alone. My parents knew I struggled with anxiety, so whenever they had to stay out late, they'd let me invite a friend over to keep me company. There was this kid who lived next door, a boy maybe a little older than me. Whenever I'd be outside, either playing or walking my dog, he'd make small talk. We weren't exactly friends, but he wasn't a total stranger either. Let's call him Zane. One evening, my parents had plans to go out for a late-night date and wouldn't be back until around 3 a.m. They told me I could invite my best friend over for a sleepover, which sounded great. Everything was going smoothly, and we were hanging out in the living room, playing video games and eating snacks. But then, right around midnight, something weird happened. I heard the sound of a window creaking open, and before I could even react, Zane started climbing through the dining room window. My heart was pounding, but I've always been a bit of a worrier, so I'd mentally prepared for something like this. I had a small knife stashed nearby just in case, and I immediately told my best friend to grab the dog, who was super protective. I wasn't exactly terrified of Zane. I'd seen him fight before, and I knew if it came down to it, I could probably defend myself. But still, the whole situation was beyond creepy. I don't remember every word, but the conversation went something like this. I blurted out, "What are you doing? Why are you crawling through my window?" Zane kind of shrugged and said, "Chill out, man. I just wanted to hang with you guys. I could hear you two laughing from my place and figured I'd come over." I told him, "You can't just break in. My parents would lose it if they found out." But Zane didn't seem to care. "I just want to hang out for a bit, grab some food, maybe play a few games. It's no big deal." At that point, he wasn't listening to a word I said, and honestly, I wasn't feeling super threatened, just annoyed. So, after going back and forth for a bit, I gave up and let him stick around. He ended up eating a bunch of my snacks too, which ticked me off. One thing that stood out, though, was how he kept avoiding the windows. He didn't make a huge deal out of it, but it was noticeable enough that it made me uneasy. Still, I brushed it off, not wanting to overthink it because, well, I was already on edge. After about an hour, he finally left, and my friend and I didn't think much of it afterward. The next morning, I was hanging around in the front yard, probably just messing around with something, when I saw Zane outside. His older sister was chewing him out, and it looked like he was in serious trouble. I couldn't help but laugh a little and asked her what was going on. Her answer hit me like a punch to the gut. She told me he'd been hiding from the police the night before. Apparently, he'd beaten up some kids so badly that they ended up in the hospital, and he'd destroyed some property at the school too. After hearing that, I did everything I could to steer clear of him and his whole family. Not long after, we ended up moving, and I was more than happy to never run into Zane again. So yeah, Zane, the kid who broke into my house while running from the cops, let's not meet again. For a little background, I grew up surrounded by open farmland, living in an old house from the 1890s. The place was huge, with lots of rundown sheds and barns scattered around, leftovers from when the original owner built it. A 2-lane road ran nearby, usually deserted at night, with maybe 1 or 2 cars passing by. Across the road, about 150 feet into the field, there was this old shed that always gave me the creeps. As kids, my friends and I would dare each other to check it out, but we always ended up going together. Nothing spooky ever turned up. We'd find some rusty tools, broken glass, or random junk. It had no power or anything to make it seem like anyone would want to stay there. As the years passed, the shed just became part of the scenery for me. I didn't think much of it, but one night, while I was watching TV, I noticed something weird. A light outside my window kept flickering on and off. It startled me for a second, but I brushed it off, thinking it was just cars passing by on the road more often than usual. Another hour passed, and by then it was almost midnight. The light was still there, but now it stayed on without flickering. That's when I realized for sure that it was coming from outside. My family was all asleep, so I couldn't ask anyone to check it with me. I was only 17 and pretty nervous, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. Nobody was going to come with me, so I grabbed my flashlight and the only thing close to a weapon I had, a small pocket knife, and stepped outside. As I got closer to the road, the light suddenly went out, making my breath catch in my throat. I had to see for myself what was going on. With my heart pounding, I made my way to the shed, where there was no door, just an open space. I stepped inside slowly, shining my flashlight around, hoping it was just my imagination. But what happened next is something I'll never shake. About 5 feet ahead of me, there was this old, worn-out armchair, one my dad had thrown in there a while back, saying he'd get rid of it someday. As I swept the light across it, I noticed it move, just a little, like it was rocking. I froze, pointing the flashlight directly at it. Then, out of nowhere, a man stood up from the chair. He didn't say a word. He looked like he was in his 40s, wearing some kind of heavy jacket. Before I could even make sense of it, my body took over, and I was already running as fast as I could. I tore across the field, my mind racing, terrified he was right behind me. The run felt endless. Every step toward my house felt like it took an eternity. But just as I reached the porch, something made me stop and look back. There he was, standing completely still in the middle of the road, not moving, not speaking. Just staring. That was almost 8 years ago, but the shed is still there, and so is that chair. My dad still thinks I made the whole thing up. He never got rid of the recliner. The worst part? The chair was always facing the window, pointed directly toward my house. I hope I never have to see him again.